Vivian Russo was still wearing the silk robe when Celeste walked through the front door. Not hiding, not scrambling for an excuse. Standing in the center of the Moretti kitchen with a coffee cup in one hand and Dante's monogrammed robe hanging loose off one shoulder, like she owned the place, like she'd been there long enough to stop pretending she hadn't. Celeste didn't scream, she didn't throw anything, she just stood in the doorway with her overnight bag still on her shoulder and looked at the woman her husband had chosen, and something inside her went very, very quiet. That silence was the most dangerous thing that had happened in the Moretti mansion in 9 years. If that were you, standing in your own home, looking at the life you built being worn by someone else, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories on this channel don't stop at one. Like this video, and drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story has already traveled. Let's find out together. Now, stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about power, love, and the price of silence. She had not planned to come home early. That was the part that would stay with Celeste long after everything else blurred, the sheer randomness of it. Her flight from New York had landed 2 hours ahead of schedule because a storm had cleared faster than anyone expected. She hadn't called ahead. Dante always told her the mansion was staffed around the clock, that she never needed to announce herself. "This is your home," he used to say, back when those words still felt like they meant something. The gate guard, a thick-necked man named Gus, who had worked for the Moretti family for 11 years, had waved her through with the familiar nod she'd seen 1,000 times. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't looked away too quickly. Either he didn't know, or he'd been in this business long enough to understand that his job was to move the gate arm, not to manage other people's marriages. Celeste had noticed his eyes, though. She noticed everything. That was the part of her that Dante had always said made her difficult. The part that watched, cataloged, filed things away for later without letting anything show on her face. 9 years of being a mafia boss's wife teaches you that. She'd set her bag down in the foyer. The house smelled like it always did. Expensive candles, leather, the faint chemical bite of cleaning products the housekeeper used on the marble floors. And underneath all of that, something she couldn't name yet. Something warm and domestic that didn't belong. She'd followed that smell to the kitchen. And there was Vivian Russo, 29 years old, Dante's financial advisor, wearing a cream-colored silk robe that had been a birthday gift from Dante to Celeste 4 years ago. Monogrammed, CM on the left breast pocket. Standing at the kitchen island, with one bare foot resting on the other, scrolling through her phone with the ease of a woman who had forgotten or stopped caring that she was a guest. Vivian looked up. Her expression moved through a series of calculations that took less than 2 seconds. Surprise, assessment, decision, and settled on something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite defiance. It was something in between. Something that said, "I knew this was coming eventually, and I decided I could live with it." That was when Celeste understood that this hadn't been a single mistake. A mistake left marks on a person's face. What Vivian had on her face was the smoothed-over look of someone who had made peace with a recurring situation. "Mrs. Moretti," Vivian said. Her voice was controlled. "Careful." Celeste said nothing. She looked at the robe for a long moment. She looked at Vivian's bare feet on the kitchen tile. She looked at the 2 coffee cups on the counter, one with lipstick on the rim, one without. She looked at the fact that Vivian had not reached to close the robe tighter, had not set down the coffee cup, had not moved at all, actually. Then she turned around and walked back to the foyer, picked up her bag, and went upstairs. The master bedroom closet was large enough to be its own room. Dante had designed it that way because Dante designed everything for maximum effect. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on one side for his suits, his shirts, the rows of shoes he never actually counted but always maintained. Her side had the same architecture, the same shelving, the same custom lighting. And she stood in front of it for almost a minute before she moved. She was not thinking about Vivian. She was not thinking about Dante. She was thinking about a storage unit in Wicker Park that she'd been paying $72 a month for the last 7 years. The one that held her grandmother's upright piano, the one she'd played through high school and the first 2 years of college before Dante Moretti walked into a fundraiser dinner and changed the entire direction of her life. She was thinking about whether the piano was still in tune. She pulled one suitcase from the back of the closet, not the large one, the mid-sized carry-on she'd used for weekend trips, back when she and Dante had still taken those. She opened it on the bed and looked at it for a moment, this empty rectangle, this simple container, and thought, just the things that were mine before him. That narrowed it down considerably. She took the photograph of her mother from the nightstand. She took the small leather journal she'd kept since she was 17. She took a handful of pieces from the jewelry box. Not the diamonds Dante had given her, not the emerald earrings from their 5th anniversary, not any of it. Just the thin gold chain her grandmother had pressed into her hand before she died, and the pearl studs she'd bought herself with her first paycheck from the music academy, where she'd briefly taught before she married into a life that made teaching seem quaint. She took her laptop, her chargers, a week's worth of clothes from the practical end of her wardrobe, the things she'd bought for herself, not the things Dante had sent stylists to select for her. She did not take the fur coat. She did not take the matching luggage set. She did not take the watch. She zipped the suitcase and stood back and looked at it, and the lightness of what she was leaving behind hit her like cold air. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs. Fast ones. What? It was not Dante. It was Marco, one of the house security detail, a young guy with a nervous energy she'd never quite trusted. He stopped in the doorway of the master bedroom and looked at the suitcase and looked at her face and looked at the suitcase again. "Mrs. Moretti, is everything okay?" "Fine," she said. "Mr. Moretti is—" "I didn't ask where he was." Marco's mouth closed. He had the particular stillness of a man who understood that he was standing at the edge of something he had no business being near. "Is there anything you need?" She looked at him. He was maybe 26. He had a younger sister. She remembered that from a conversation at a family Christmas dinner, the way his face had opened up when he talked about her. He was just a kid doing a job he probably hadn't fully thought through when he took it. "Call me a car," she said. "To the front. 10 minutes. He hesitated. She watched the hesitation, watched him calculate whether this was a request he was authorized to fulfill without checking with someone above him. She watched him decide that refusing the boss's wife was more dangerous than complying. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and disappeared. She picked up the suitcase and went back to the closet and stood there one more time. On Dante's side, there was a photograph tucked into the corner of one of the shelves. Not on display, half hidden behind a row of belts. She and Dante on a boat in Lake Michigan, maybe 5 years ago. They were both laughing at something out of frame. She looked genuinely happy in it. So did he. She left the photograph where it was. Vivian was no longer in the kitchen when Celeste came back downstairs. She had retreated somewhere, upstairs maybe, or into one of the other rooms, and Celeste didn't go looking for her. There was nothing she wanted to say to Vivian Russo. There was nothing that Vivian could say that would matter. The woman had made her choice, and Dante had made his, and now Celeste was making hers, and the geometry of it was simple enough. She waited in the foyer. She did not sit down. She stood with her suitcase at her side and looked at the house. Really looked at it, the way you only look at something you know you're leaving, and tried to find the place inside her where grief was supposed to be. It was there. She wasn't foolish enough to think it wasn't, but it was quiet, buried under something heavier and older. A particular exhaustion that she recognized now as the accumulated weight of 9 years of accommodating a man whose world always had to be the largest thing in the room. The car arrived in 8 minutes. She walked out the front door without looking back. Dante Moretti came home at 6:17 in the evening, 2 hours after Celeste's car had pulled out of the gate. He knew something was wrong the moment he stepped inside. Not because the house looked different, it didn't, not in any visible way. The lights were on, the staff was moving quietly through their routines. The smell of dinner being prepared drifted from the kitchen. But there was something in the air, some weight or absence of weight, that a man who has spent his adult life reading rooms could not miss. He found Vivian in the sitting room off the main hallway, still wearing the robe. She'd had enough self-awareness to add a blanket across her lap, at least, and the look on her face when he walked in was not the look she usually gave him. It was careful and closed and slightly defensive. "Where's Celeste?" he said. Vivian set her wine glass down slowly. "She came home early." The words were simple enough, but the silence between them, the silence that said, "and she saw me and she left," was louder than any argument in that house had ever been. Dante stood very still. He had a particular way of going still when he was processing something he hadn't anticipated, a quality his men had learned to read as the calm before something irreversible. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the suitcase-sized empty space in his mind where Celeste was supposed to be. What did she take? Vivian looked at him. I don't know. I didn't go upstairs. He walked past her without another word. He went upstairs and stood in the doorway of the closet for 3 minutes. He counted the absences. He had not known, until that moment, how precisely he had memorized the arrangement of her things. The way a person memorizes something they expect to always be there, the way you know the layout of your house in the dark. He knew the photograph of her mother was gone from the nightstand without having to look. He knew, without checking the jewelry box, that the diamond earrings were still there. That told him everything. She hadn't taken what he gave her. She'd taken what she brought. He sat down on the edge of the bed and put his hands on his knees and stared at the floor for a long moment. He did not call her. That would surprise the people who worked for him, if they'd known. They expected Dante Moretti to react to a missing thing the way he reacted to everything, with immediate, directed force. But Celeste was not a missing asset. She was not a problem with a solution. She was a woman who had walked out of his house with a carry-on bag and a 9-year marriage, and the part of him that understood people, really understood them, past the performance and the fear and the loyalty, knew that calling her right now would accomplish nothing except make her certain she had made the right choice. He sat there long enough for the room to go dark. Then he got up and went downstairs and told Vivian to get dressed, that he needed to speak with Luca, and that she should find somewhere else to be tonight. Vivian, to her credit, did not argue. Well, Luca Moretti was 34, 3 years younger than Dante, and where Dante had their father's width and stillness, Luca had their mother's quickness, in his face, in his hands, in the speed with which he processed information and shifted posture. He was at his own apartment when Dante called, and he arrived at the mansion within 20 minutes, which said something about the tone of the call. He stood in the study and listened while Dante explained what had happened. He did not interrupt. When Dante finished, Luca was quiet for a moment, turning the information over. Celeste left, he said finally. That's what I said. No. Celeste left. Not walked out to cool down. Not staying with a friend for a few days. She left. Dante looked at him. I know what I said. Luca exhaled through his nose. He sat down in the leather chair across from Dante's desk and looked at his brother with an expression that was carefully neutral in a way that took effort. How long has Vivian been? That's not what we need to talk about. Dante, it's done. What I need to know is where Celeste went and whether she's safe. Luca nodded slowly. I'll have someone check her usual. Quietly, Dante said. She's not a target. She's not a liability. You put one person on it, someone she doesn't know, and I want to know she's physically safe. That's it. Luca looked at his brother for a long moment. You're not going to go after her. Not tonight. Dante, I said not tonight, Luca. There was something in Dante's voice, not anger exactly, but the weight of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of his own damage and is standing in it. Luca recognized it. He didn't push. Okay, he said. I'll handle it quietly. Celeste checked into a hotel in Lincoln Park that she'd stayed at years before Dante, years before any of this. It was not a luxury hotel. It had decent beds and a small desk and a view of the street below where she could hear traffic and voices and the ordinary sounds of a city that did not care about her name. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her suitcase for a long time. She was 41 years old. She had a college degree she'd stopped using. She had a marriage that had been quietly disintegrating for years, while she told herself it was simply evolving, adapting, finding its new shape. She had a skill she had buried so deeply she wasn't sure it was still alive. She pulled out her phone and opened the browser and searched. Piano Rental Chicago, by the hour. She didn't know why she did that first before calling her sister, before booking anything for longer than one night, before doing any of the practical things that the situation required. She just knew that she needed to hear something true, something that predated all of this, and the only language she trusted to tell the truth in was the one she'd learned before she knew anything about the Moretti family. She found a place, a music studio in Wicker Park, 2 blocks from the storage unit. They rented practice rooms by the hour. uprights and grands, available by appointment. She booked 2 hours for the following morning, and then she sat back and felt something move in her chest. Not hope exactly, too early for that, but something that had been asleep. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was Dante's number. She put the phone face down on the bed and did not pick it up. Over the next 4 days, Dante called 11 times. He did not leave voicemails after the third call. He understood that Celeste not answering was itself a message, and that filling her voicemail with his voice was the wrong move. He texted once on the second day. "I know you need space. I'm not going to pretend that's not fair. I just want to know you're safe. One word, if you can." She didn't respond to the text. He knew from the man he'd quietly placed nearby that she was in Lincoln Park, that she was eating, that she'd been seen entering a music studio on 2 consecutive mornings. That last piece of information sat strangely in his chest. He didn't fully know what to do with it. He had known, abstractly, that Celeste had played piano. She'd mentioned it in the early years, casually, the way people mention things they've moved past. He'd never heard her play. He'd never thought to ask. He tried to remember if he'd ever asked. On the third day, Vivian came back to the mansion to collect the things she'd left behind. A bag of clothes, a laptop, some personal items from what had apparently become a semi-permanent arrangement in the guest suite that Dante had somehow not made explicit even to himself. He met her in the sitting room. He was not angry at her, which surprised him when he examined the feeling. He was something more complicated than angry. He was sitting in the specific discomfort of a man who had allowed something to happen in increments, each increment small enough to rationalize, until the accumulated weight of all of it had collapsed one ordinary Tuesday afternoon. "I'm not going to make a scene," he told her. "I know," she said. "I want you to know I don't blame you for—" "You don't have to do this, Dante." He looked at her. She was good at this, Vivian. The contained, precise way she managed conversations, the way she could deflect sentiment without appearing cold. It was one of the things that had made her effective in her role. He found for the first time that effectiveness mildly unsettling. "You're still on the payroll through end of month," he said. "I'll have accounting wire a severance." She nodded. She picked up her bag. At the door, she paused without turning around. "For what it's worth?" She seemed calmer than I expected. Dante said nothing. "That's not a good sign," Vivian said. "What that?" And walked out. He thought about that for days. Calmer than I expected. He had seen Celeste angry. She could be genuinely, piercingly angry when pushed far enough, the kind of anger that was precise rather than explosive. He'd seen her hurt. He'd seen her disappointed in the particular silent way that was worse than anything she could have said out loud. But calm at the end, calm as she packed, meant that something in her had completed a process he hadn't known was running. It meant she had been arriving at this conclusion for longer than yesterday. He found himself going back through time with a new lens, looking at moments he'd filed under difficult period or rough patch, or she's adjusting and seeing them differently now. The dinner 3 years ago where she had laughed at something one of his captains said, and the laugh had been completely real, and he had noticed it because it was the first completely real laugh he'd heard from her in months, and he had noted it and then forgotten it by the next morning. The birthday she'd spent mostly in the upstairs library, claiming a headache, and he had sent someone to check on her and not gone himself because he had a call he couldn't move. The way she had stopped bringing up the storage unit, the piano, anything from before, and how he had interpreted that silence as contentment rather than surrender. He had been reading her wrong for years, or he had been choosing not to read her at all. That was the part that kept coming back, the part that sat in his chest like something lodged wrong. He had not been inattentive, he had been selective. He had kept track of everything that mattered to the operation, to the family, to the countless moving parts of his world, and he had quietly, efficiently deprioritized the one person who kept that world from becoming entirely unlivable. He told himself he would fix it. He told himself he would reach her. He didn't yet understand that reaching her was no longer the point. Well, on the 6th day, Celeste called her sister. Her sister's name was Dana, and she lived in Milwaukee with her husband and 2 teenagers and a golden retriever named Archie. And she had never fully trusted Dante Moretti, not because of what she knew, but because of the things she noticed Celeste stop saying over the years. She answered on the 2nd ring. "I left Dante," Celeste said. Dana was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then, "How long ago?" 6 days. Where are you? Lincoln Park. Okay. Are you? Dana stopped herself, recalibrated. Do you need me to come? No, Celeste said. And then, because Dana deserved the truth, maybe in a few weeks. Right now, I just needed to say it out loud to someone who would understand what it cost. Dana understood. She had a gift for that, for understanding the weight of things without requiring an explanation of all the steps. She said, I'm proud of you. And she meant it. And Celeste had to put the phone down for a moment and breathe through something that had been pressing against the inside of her chest for days. I found a studio, Celeste said when she came back. I've been playing every morning. The piano. Dana said it softly. Celeste. It's rusty. My left hand is embarrassing. That's okay? I know. I know it is. She exhaled. I forgot what it felt like to do something that was only mine. There was a long pause. Outside, rain had started up again. Thin, cold, mid-October rain that blurred the window and made the room feel sealed off from everything else. It was not an unpleasant feeling. What are you going to do? Dana asked. I don't know yet, Celeste said, but I think I'm going to keep playing. By the end of the second week, the studio manager, a woman in her 50s named Ruth, who wore her gray hair in a severe bun and had the manner of someone who had survived several significant disappointments without becoming bitter, had started leaving the practice room reserved for Celeste even on mornings when she hadn't booked ahead. You're here every day, Ruth said one morning, not unkindly. Might as well. Celeste thanked her and didn't explain. She sat down at the Steinway Grand, the studio's one good instrument, tucked in the back room that caught the morning light, and she played. She was rusty. She hadn't lied to Dana about that. The first 3 days had been genuinely painful, not emotionally, but technically, the specific humiliation of muscle memory that had dimmed, of pieces she had once played fluidly now stuttering through her fingers like a signal with bad reception. She had practiced 3 hours a day in high school. She had played in 2 college recitals. She had been good, not prodigy good, but real good, the kind of good that comes from loving something enough to suffer for it. She had walked away from all of that at 22 to plan a wedding. She did not let herself be angry about it. Not yet. Anger was a luxury she'd give herself later, when the more immediate work was done. Right now, she just played. She worked through Chopin, which she'd always loved. She worked through a Debussy nocturne she'd nearly memorized at 19 and could still find mostly in her hands. She made mistakes. She corrected them. She made them again. She sat with the frustration of it and kept going. Ruth started bringing her coffee without being asked. By the end of the second week, the stuttering had mostly stopped. Her left hand was finding its way back. And something else was happening, something she hadn't anticipated, which was that she was playing with more feeling than she ever had at 19 when the technique had been cleaner. She had more inside her now. It had nowhere to go except through her hands and into the keys. 3 weeks after Celeste left the mansion, Luca Moretti called Dante into his office at the warehouse they used for legitimate business operations, a shipping company that moved real freight and also served the other purposes such companies serve in families like theirs. Luca's face was different when Dante arrived. Tighter. He had the look of a man who had discovered something he wished he hadn't and was now managing both the information and the emotional response to having it. Close the door, Luca said. Dante closed it. Luca set a folder on the desk between them, but didn't open it. He looked at his brother. How much did Vivian have access to? The question landed with a particular weight. Dante's eyes moved to the folder. Explain the question. Her access. Financial records, meeting schedules, the offshore account structures, the Bellini framework. Luca paused. How much? She was my financial advisor, Luca. She had operational access to... He stopped. He looked at his brother's face again, and something in his chest went cold. What did you find? Luca opened the folder. It was a thread. 6 months of it. Communication records, access logs, financial transfers in small amounts that would have looked like ordinary accounting if you weren't looking for a pattern. The kind of thing that required someone who knew exactly where to look to find, and exactly what it meant when they did. Vivian Russo had been feeding information to Marco Bellini for at least 6 months, possibly longer. Dante looked at the pages for a long time without speaking. The thing about a man who has built his life on reading people accurately is that the discovery of a major misread is not just a security problem. It is something more personal than that. It is a specific category of humiliation, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles in quietly and stays. She was placed, Dante said finally. It wasn't a question. Looks that way. She came in through our accounting firm, the referral we trusted. Bellini's been patient. This was a long play. Dante nodded slowly. He looked at the folder. He thought about Vivian standing in the kitchen in Celeste's robe, the cool calculation in her face. He thought about how he had read that calculation as simple defiance and had not looked deeper. He thought about all the meetings Vivian had sat in on, all the documents she'd reviewed, all the dinners where she'd heard things that were not meant for outside ears. And then he thought about Celeste walking through the front door and taking the fall for an arrangement that had been designed, perhaps not entirely, but significantly, by a woman who had used him as an information source. The expression on his face was not one his men would have recognized. It was not anger. It was something quieter and more permanent than anger. "Get me everything," he said. "Every thread." Luca nodded. "There's more. I think she's still in contact. I said everything, Luca. I know, I'm telling you it's not clean. This is going to take time." Dante stood and buttoned his jacket. He looked at his brother. "How much time?" "Weeks. Maybe a month?" He nodded. He picked up his jacket from the chair back. At the door, he stopped. "Does this change anything about Celeste?" Luca looked at him. "For you or for her?" "For her," Dante said. "Does she need protection?" "From Bellini?" Luca considered it. "I don't think he knows she matters to you anymore, and she's not connected to the business. She's just—" He hesitated. "She's a woman at a piano studio in Lincoln Park." Dante stood with his hand on the door handle. Something in his face moved, barely perceptibly. "Keep the detail on her anyway," he said. "Loose. She doesn't need to see it." He walked out. The fourth week, Celeste went back to the storage unit. She had been putting it off. She knew the piano was there, knew the movers Dante had hired when they moved into the mansion, had wrapped it carefully and stored it correctly because she had supervised it herself, and she had been very clear about what careful meant. But going to the unit meant confronting not just the piano, but the larger fact of it, that she had paid $72 a month for 7 years to store a piece of her former self she couldn't quite let go of, in a city she shared with a man who never once asked her about it. She went on a Wednesday morning. She brought a flashlight and a bottle of water. She unlocked the unit and pulled up the rolling door and stood in the entrance for a moment, looking in. The piano was at the back, wrapped in padded moving blankets and covered with a canvas tarp. The unit smelled of dust and the particular damp cold of a space that had been sealed for years. She walked in slowly, stepping around boxes, and stood in front of the piano for a moment before she pulled the tarp off. The wood was dusty. The keys were still covered with a thin cloth she'd put there herself. She lifted it, revealing the keys underneath, slightly yellowed at the edges. One or two with the faintest discoloration, but intact. She reached out and pressed middle C. The note that came out was not in tune. It was close, but years of storage had shifted things. It was middle C reaching for itself through a slight haze, familiar but off by enough to notice. She pressed it again. And then she sat down on the storage unit floor, on the cold concrete, in her good coat, in the cold, and laughed. Not the bright performance laugh she'd perfected over 9 years of Moretti dinner parties. A real laugh, rough and surprised and slightly unhinged, the laugh of a person who has been holding something together for a very long time and has just felt it begin to release. She was still laughing when she pulled out her phone to call a piano tuner. By the time part 1 of this story closes, 3 things are true. Dante Moretti sits at his desk with a folder full of evidence that the woman he chose over his wife was not what she appeared to be. And the weight of that knowledge is something no amount of power or money makes lighter. Luca Moretti has begun pulling on a thread that leads somewhere far more dangerous than a personal betrayal. And Celeste Moretti, who is no longer sure she wants to be Celeste Moretti, is sitting in a music studio in Lincoln Park at 7 in the morning, playing a Chopin nocturne that makes the studio manager stop in the hallway and stand very still and listen without saying a word. Her hands are finding their way back. She is not thinking about Dante. She is not thinking about Vivian, or the robe, or the look on Vivian's face that morning. She is thinking about the space between notes, about the silence that gives music its shape. And she is finding, slowly and without permission from anyone, that the silence inside her is beginning to fill with something she recognizes. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Herself. The Steinway in the back room of Ruth's studio was not perfectly in tune either. It needed work on the upper registers, a fact Ruth apologized for every few days in the offhand way of someone who had been meaning to do something about it for 2 years. But Celeste had stopped noticing the imperfection somewhere around the 3rd week. That was the thing about returning to something you'd loved before you knew how to protect the things you loved. The imperfections became part of the texture. You stopped needing it to be perfect. You just needed it to be real. She was there at 6:50 on a Tuesday morning when her phone rang for the first time in 4 days with a number she didn't recognize. She let it ring. She let it go to voicemail. She kept playing. A Brahms intermezzo she'd been working back into her hands for the past week, slower than it should have been. The phrasing slightly tentative in places where she hadn't yet reclaimed the confidence the piece required. The voicemail notification appeared. She ignored it and kept playing. 20 minutes later, the same number called again. She stopped, set her hands in her lap, looked at the phone on top of the piano. Something in the repetition, the specific patience of it, the 2-call rhythm, made her pick it up. Celeste Moretti? The voice was female, older, warm, but professionally contained. My name is Sandra Holt. I'm a producer with the Meridian Cultural Series at the Chicago Civic Arts Foundation. We host a monthly series of live performances, classical, primarily, though we've expanded in recent seasons. We had a cancellation for our upcoming November program and someone gave us your name. We were wondering if you'd be interested in filling the slot. Celeste sat very still on the piano bench. I haven't performed publicly in... She stopped. Did the math. 19 years. I know, Sandra Holt said. The person who gave us your name was aware of that. They said it with some enthusiasm, actually. They used the phrase, "That's exactly why she's right for it." Celeste frowned. Who gave you my name? A brief pause. Ruth Nakamura. She said she'd been listening to you for 3 weeks and that she had something she needed to say to you directly, but that she was worried you'd refuse if she asked, so she thought going around you was the kinder option. Celeste closed her eyes. She heard Ruth's voice in her head, the flat, practical tone the woman used for everything. Might as well keep the room reserved. You're here every day anyway. And felt something between irritation and a gratitude so sharp it was almost painful. When is November? She said. 3 weeks? That's not a lot of time. No, Sandra Holt agreed. Is that a no? Celeste looked at the piano. She looked at her hands resting on her thighs, the calluses just beginning to reform on her fingertips, the left hand finally cooperating the way it used to. It's not a no, she said. Give me 24 hours. She confronted Ruth about it the same morning. Ruth was in the front office, going through paperwork with the reading glasses she always pretended she didn't need, and she looked up when Celeste appeared in the doorway with a particular expression on her face. You called someone, Celeste said. I did, Ruth said, and went back to her paperwork. Without asking me. Correct. Ruth turned a page. Do you want coffee? I made a fresh pot. Celeste stood in the doorway. She was not exactly angry. She recognized that her irritation was mostly the defensive reflex of someone who had been making themselves small for so long that being seen felt like a violation. She recognized it, and the recognition made the irritation collapse into something more complicated. What if I'm not ready? She said. Ruth looked up over her glasses. She had the face of a woman who had heard many excuses, none of them convincing. You're playing better than most of the people I've hosted in this studio for 20 years. You're playing better than you think you are. And you're using "I'm not ready" the way people use it when they mean "I'm afraid," which is fair, but those are 2 different problems. Celeste said nothing. The slot is 45 minutes, Ruth said. 1 program. 200 people, maybe 250. The venue has excellent acoustics. She took off her glasses and set them on the desk. I have been in this business for a very long time, and I have watched people talk themselves out of the things they were born to do, and I find it depressing, so I made a phone call. You can be angry at me about it if it makes you feel better. Celeste looked at her for a long moment. What if I play badly? Ruth put her glasses back on. Then you'll have played badly in front of 250 people who were not there to judge you, and you'll know more about what you need to work on. That is also useful." She said yes that evening. She called Sandra Holt back from her hotel room, sitting cross-legged on the bed, with a legal pad in front of her on which she'd spent the afternoon writing out a program. The Chopin Nocturne, the Brahms, a Schubert piece she hadn't played since college but could retrieve, she thought, if she had 3 weeks and the stubbornness she'd carried her whole life. She gave Sandra Holt the program. Sandra Holt read it back to her. Celeste said yes, that was right. She did not tell Dana. Not yet. She wanted to hold it quietly for a day or two, this decision that was entirely her own. She did not tell Dante. At the Moretti warehouse on the near south side, the quiet was of a different kind. Luca had spread the Vivian Russo materials across the long table in the back room, the room they used for internal matters that required privacy and a surface large enough to lay things out. He had 3 men he trusted working through the financial records, cross-referencing account numbers against a list of Bellini-linked entities that one of their contacts in the city had provided. The work was slow and technical, requiring the kind of attention that was harder to sustain as the hours accumulated and the room grew stale with the smell of cold coffee. Dante came in at 9 in the evening, still in his jacket, and stood at the head of the table. He looked at what they had. "Tell me the shape of it," he said to Luca. Luca stood up from his chair and stretched his back, the motion of a man who had been sitting in the same position for too long. She was moving information in 2 directions. Financial intelligence, our exposure, our reserve positions, the offshore structure, that went to a contact we're tracking to a holding company in Miami that traces back to Bellini's operation. The second thread is more operational, meetings, summaries, guest lists. Twice, Dante. She forwarded advance notice of meetings we held here. The room went very still. "She knew our schedules," one of the men at the table said, and immediately seemed to regret speaking. Dante did not look at him. He looked at the papers. "How long was she placed before she came to us through the accounting firm?" "We don't know yet. At least 6 months of prep before the introduction, based on what we're seeing." Luca rubbed the back of his neck. "Bellini planned this carefully. He let her build trust, let her get comfortable, and then—" He stopped. "And then I made her comfortable for him," Dante said. Nobody said anything. Dante pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. He unbuttoned the top button of his shirt. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at the spread of papers, and the men at the table watched him do it and waited. "The Miami contact," Dante said. "Do we have a name?" "Working on it. 48 hours, maybe less." "The advance meeting summaries, how did they go out?" "Personal email. Encrypted, but we broke it. She was thorough, but she made one mistake." Luca picked up a page and set it in front of Dante. "She forwarded one summary from a device connected to our guest Wi-Fi. We have a timestamp." Dante looked at the timestamp. He looked at the date. He remembered that evening. It had been a dinner for 7 people, a meeting with 2 visiting associates from out of state, the kind of dinner where no phones should have been out at the table. He remembered Vivian excusing herself for 10 minutes to use the restroom, and he remembered not thinking anything of it. He set the paper down. What did the meeting summary contain? Luca hesitated. Names, the 2 visiting associates, their city of origin, the general nature of the conversation. Are those 2 men safe? We reached out. They're aware. They're, Luca chose his word carefully, displeased. I imagine they are. Dante was quiet for a moment. Is there anything in what she sent out that creates immediate danger for our operations? Not immediate, but Bellini has information now that gives him leverage we didn't know he had. If he uses it, he'll use it, Dante said. The question is when and how. He stood. He picked up his jacket. He walked to the window, a narrow, high window that showed nothing but the top of a fence and a strip of night sky, and stood with his back to the room. Is Vivian still in the city? He said. As of this morning, yes. I don't want her approached yet. I don't want her to know what we've found. If she's still in contact with Bellini, I want that channel open until we're ready to close it on our terms. Luca nodded slowly. And Bellini? Dante turned from the window. His face was composed, but it was the kind of composure that requires maintenance, the controlled surface over something that was moving underneath. I want to know everything about his current operation, what he has, where he's exposed, who he trusts. We do that quietly, and we do it correctly, and we don't move until we know the whole board. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, the same gesture as before, as if doorways were the place where he collected himself before stepping into the next room. "And Celeste," he said. "Details still on her," Luca said. "Loose. She doesn't know. Has she—" He stopped, started again. "Has anything changed for her? Her situation?" Luca looked at his brother. He thought about whether to say it. He said it. "She's performing. November. A music series downtown." The silence lasted about 3 seconds. "Good," Dante said, and walked out. The news about the performance spread the way these things do in a city where certain names carry weight in certain rooms. Not through any announcement, Celeste had not made one, but through the Civic Arts Foundation's mailing list, which went to several hundred people in Chicago's cultural community, some of whom overlapped with the larger social world that the Moretti family had orbited for years. By the end of the week, Dana had seen the listing online and called Celeste from Milwaukee with a sound in her voice that was somewhere between tears and triumph. "You're doing a concert," Dana said. "It's not a concert. It's a 45-minute program at a mid-sized venue." "Celeste." "I know," Celeste said quietly. "I know what it is." She was in the practice room, the Steinway behind her, the morning light coming through the side window at the angle she'd started to think of as hers. She had been at the studio 6 days a week. Her fingertips had calluses again, real ones, the kind that took weeks to build and announced themselves when she pressed too hard against a tight sweater. She was sleeping better than she had in years. "Are you nervous?" Dana asked. "Terrified," Celeste said. "But it's a different kind of terrified than—" She paused, trying to find the right shape for it. "Than the scared I've felt for the past few years. This kind goes forward. That kind went in circles." Dana was quiet for a moment. "Is Dante going to know about it?" "He probably already does." Another pause. "Does that worry you?" Celeste thought about it. Honestly thought about it. Not the reflexive answer, not the brave answer. "No," she said finally. "That's the strange part. It doesn't." Dante knew. He had known for 4 days. He had also, in those 4 days, not called her, not sent anyone to speak to her, not done anything except sit with the knowledge and examine what he felt about it, which was not a process he was naturally inclined toward, but which the past several weeks had forced on him with the consistency of a recurring bill. What he felt was something he didn't have a clean word for. Pride was part of it, which seemed absurd given that he had contributed nothing to what she was building. But there was something prior to pride, something that recognized that the woman he'd watched dim and flatten over the years was returning to her own brightness, and that the recognition produced in him not satisfaction, but an acute and well-deserved discomfort. He had spent 9 years living next to a pianist who never played. He had thought he was giving her safety, a home, resources, a life of consequence. He had not thought about what he was taking by requiring her life to exist entirely within the borders of his. He sat with that. He also sat with the operational reality of what Luca had found, which required a different kind of sitting, the cold, tactical kind that his family had bred into him since childhood. The two sat in him simultaneously, the personal reckoning and the professional crisis, and he managed them the way he managed most things, sequentially in public, simultaneously in private, showing neither to anyone who didn't need to see it. The Bellini situation was moving faster than he'd hoped. His contact in Miami came back with a name, Raymond Chu, a financial broker who moved money for 3 different organized crime structures on the East Coast, and whose connection to Bellini was recent enough to suggest that this operation had been assembled specifically for this purpose, for this target, with a patience and sophistication that Dante had not seen from Bellini before. Bellini was not known for patience. He was known for direct confrontation, for aggression, for the kind of operationally loud moves that drew attention but achieved results through sheer force. The careful, long-play infiltration of the Moretti family through a planted advisor was not Bellini's natural style, which meant someone was advising Bellini, someone who understood the Moretti operation well enough to identify its pressure points and clever enough to design a strategy that used proximity and trust as its primary weapons. That bothered Dante more than the breach itself. He called Luca at 11 that night. Who else knew about the financial advisor referral? Luca was quiet for a moment. The introduction came through Ferrante's firm. Dante said nothing. Ferrante was 60 years old and had handled the Moretti family's legitimate accounting for 11 years. He was either complicit or compromised, and either possibility was worse than the last. I want to know which one, Dante said. Dante, quietly, Luca. I need to know before I decide what to do. If it's Ferrante, then we deal with Ferrante, Dante said. That's not the conversation I want to have right now. Find me what you can without alerting him. Give me something by Thursday. It was the following morning that Marcus, the young security man from the mansion, the one with the younger sister, came to find Luca with a look on his face that Luca had learned to read as I have something to tell you that I wish I didn't. Luca was in his car in the parking structure below the warehouse. He'd been about to leave. Marcus knocked on the window. Luca rolled it down. I saw something this morning, Marcus said. At the coffee place on Dearborn. I wasn't surveilling, I was just there. But Vivian was there. And she was with someone. Luca waited. I didn't know him. But I've seen him once before, 2 months ago, at the opening for that restaurant in River North. He was with Bellini's people that night. I noticed because he was the only one not Italian. Luca's jaw tightened. You get a photo? Marcus held up his phone. The image was taken from a distance, slightly blurred. A coffee shop window, 2 figures at a corner table. Vivian Russo in a gray coat, leaning forward, her hands wrapped around a cup. Across from her a man Luca didn't know but whose face he could now find. Good, Luca said. Get in. Sup? The photograph went to 3 different people over the next 6 hours, and by late afternoon, Luca had a name, Peter Vance, 37, American-born, no criminal record, which meant either he was clean or he was very good at staying clean, who operated as a private intelligence consultant with a client list that was, according to their contact, deliberately difficult to verify. Private intelligence consultant. Dante turned the phrase over when Luca delivered the report that evening. He's a handler, Dante said. That's my read. So Vivian is still active. She's not just waiting for this to blow over. She's still reporting. Meeting in a public coffee shop in broad daylight is either arrogance or a signal, Luca said. Either she thinks we haven't figured out what she was doing yet, or she's sending Bellini information about our response. Or both, Dante said. She's not stupid, Luca. She wouldn't be arrogant about it unless she had a reason to feel protected. The sentence landed in the room, and neither of them said immediately what it implied. That Vivian's confidence required an explanation. That the explanation, if she was still active and unafraid, pointed towards something they hadn't found yet. Another layer. Another source. Another person inside the Moretti structure whose cooperation made her current exposure feel manageable. Dante looked at his brother. We have a second problem. Yes, Luca said. Someone she thinks will protect her if we move on her. Yes. The room was very quiet. Outside the warehouse, the city moved through its Tuesday evening routines, traffic thinning, restaurants filling, the ordinary machinery of a city that did not know or care what was happening in this room. Start at the inside, Dante said, not Ferrante. Closer than that. Who knew Vivian's schedule? Who could have told her what we found? Luca's face was doing something complicated. I don't want to say it. Say it anyway. 3 people knew the full extent of what we found before you did. Me, Caruso, and Eddie. Eddie Caruso, no relation to the other Caruso, was 28 and had been with the Moretti family for 4 years, recruited personally by Luca, trusted with incrementally more sensitive work over that time, until he was, in recent months, functioning as Luca's second in all things operational. Dante looked at his brother. He watched the thing that was happening in Luca's face, the particular grief of someone who has been betrayed by a person they championed. You don't know yet, Dante said. Not cruelly, just accurately. No, Luca said, but I know what it feels like when the math only works one way. The concert was 11 days out when Celeste had her first real crisis. She sat down at the Steinway at 7 in the morning and played the opening of the Chopin Nocturne, the piece she'd been most confident in, the one her hands knew best. And something went wrong in the middle of the second page. Not technically. Her hands didn't slip, she didn't lose the tempo, her dynamics were controlled. What went wrong was inside the music itself, in the interpretation. She hit a passage that she'd played 100 times in the past 3 weeks, and for the first time she heard what it actually said. It was about loss. The piece was about loss. She had known that intellectually, had known it the way you know facts about a room you've never entered, but sitting there at 7 in the morning with 11 days until she played it in front of 250 people, she entered the room, and the room was enormous and dark and full of the specific grief she had been managing by staying busy. She stopped playing. She sat with her hands in her lap and stared at the music stand and felt the weight of 9 years land on her all at once. Not the anger, not the clarity, not the purposeful momentum of the past month, but the grief underneath all of it, the raw fact of what had been lost and wasted and given away and taken and spent and not replaced. She sat like that for a long time, long enough that Ruth appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and looked at her and said nothing, just set the second cup on top of the piano and leaned against the doorframe. "Do you want me to go away?" Ruth asked. "No," Celeste said. Her voice came out thicker than she expected. "No, stay." Ruth stayed. She drank her coffee. She did not offer advice, which was the right thing to do, and Celeste was grateful for it in a way she couldn't have articulated. After a while, Celeste said, "I forgot what it felt like to play something you actually mean." Ruth said, "That's why you stopped being scared of it." Celeste looked at her. "What do you mean?" "When you first started coming in, you were playing at it. Technically strong, but you were playing at the piece. Now you're inside it." Ruth drank her coffee. "That's why it hit you, because you're actually in there now." Celeste looked at the keys. She put her hands back on them. She started the nocturne again. This time, she didn't fight the weight of it. She let the grief in. Let it into her fingers. Let it into the phrasing. Let the slow ache of the middle section be exactly as heavy as it was. It was not a performance of the piece. It was a conversation with it. And the piece, which had been written by a dying man who had lost the country he loved, had things to say that she was finally ready to hear. When she finished, there was a long silence. Ruth set down her cup on the doorframe shelf. Her voice, when she spoke, was matter-of-fact in the way of someone protecting something fragile. "That's what you're playing on the 11th, she said. Celeste nodded. "Don't change it," Ruth said. "Don't polish it. Play it exactly like that." 8 days before the concert, the man Luca had been watching, Eddie, who was 28 and had been recruited personally and given 4 years of trust and incrementally sensitive work, made his mistake. It was a small mistake. He left his personal cell phone in the break room of the warehouse, unlocked, while he went to get something from his car. He was gone 4 minutes. By the time he came back, the phone was exactly where he'd left it. But Luca's man had been 2 minutes ahead of him, and what Luca's man found in those 2 minutes was enough. A single text message to a number they didn't have in any of their records. 2 words, sent 40 minutes after Luca had briefed the inner group on the full extent of what they'd discovered about Vivian Russo. They know. Luca sat in his car and looked at the screenshot his man had sent him and did not move for a long time. He thought about Eddie at the recruitment dinner 4 years ago, the genuine hunger in the kid's face, the eagerness that Luca had read as loyalty. He thought about every conversation since then, every task assigned, every moment of trust extended. He looked for the place where it had turned and couldn't find it, which meant the turn had happened in private, in the space between the person you showed Luca and the person you actually were. He called Dante. "It's Eddie," he said. Dante said nothing for 3 seconds. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Another 2 seconds. "Does he know you know?" "No." "Keep it that way. Bring him in normally tomorrow. Morning briefing, nothing unusual. I'll be there." "And then?" Dante's voice was very even. "And then we have a conversation." The morning briefing was at 8. Dante arrived at 7:40, which was normal. Luca arrived at 7:50, which was normal. Eddie arrived at 8:02, which was slightly late, which was also normal for Eddie, who had a commute from Pilsen that ran long on rainy mornings. He walked in and said good morning and poured himself coffee from the pot on the side table and turned around and found Dante and Luca both looking at him with a quality of attention that was different from the usual briefing energy. Not aggressive, not hot, just very still and very present. The kind of looking that happens when people have already done all their deciding and are simply waiting for the next thing to occur. Eddie set his coffee down. He was smart enough to understand immediately what the room meant. "Okay," he said. His voice was steadier than Luca expected. Okay. Sit down, Eddie, Dante said. He sat down. The conversation that followed was not long. Dante had a gift for economy in these moments. He did not perform anger, did not build toward it. He stated what he knew. He stated what it meant. He asked two questions, one of which Eddie answered, and one of which he didn't. The one he answered was, when did it start? 14 months ago, he said, and the word 14 moved through the room like something physical. The one he didn't answer was, who approached you first? He didn't answer it because he looked at Dante's face and understood that answering it would not change what came next, and silence was all he had left that was his own. Dante stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Luca, and the look contained an entire conversation that neither of them would ever need to speak aloud. Take care of it, Dante said, and walked out. Luca sat across from Eddie in the quiet room, and the two of them, the man who had recruited him and the man who had betrayed him, looked at each other in the particular silence that follows a door closing on something that cannot be reopened. And outside the warehouse, the city went on doing what cities do, indifferent and continuous, while inside that room, something that had lasted 4 years finished ending in the space of a held breath. The door had been closed for 11 minutes when Luca's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He let it ring. Across the table, Eddie had not moved. He was sitting with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, not gripping the edge, not fidgeting, just flat, the way a man sits when he has decided that stillness is the only dignity left available to him. His coffee was getting cold beside his right hand. He hadn't touched it since he sat down. Luca set his phone face down and looked at Eddie for a long moment. 14 months, Luca said. Eddie didn't answer. I want you to understand something. Luca's voice was quiet, not gentle, quiet in the way of something that has been stripped of excess, the way a blade is quiet. I'm not asking you to explain yourself to me. I don't need the explanation. What I need is the name of the person who brought you in, because that person is the piece of this that we haven't found yet, and finding it matters more than anything you're feeling right now. Eddie looked at the table. His jaw moved slightly, the way a jaw moves when a person is holding a word behind their teeth. Eddie, I can't give you that. Luca let the silence sit. I was good at silence, had learned it from Dante, who had learned it from their father, who had understood that silence was a form of pressure that most people couldn't sustain without feeling it. He waited. It's not about loyalty, Eddie said finally, still looking at the table. I want you to know that. It's not about protecting anyone. It's that if I give you that name, what happens to me happens faster. Luca looked at him. What happens to you is already decided, Eddie. I know. He said it without self-pity, which was the thing that made it hardest to sit across from him. He said it like a man stating a weather forecast. I know that, but there's a difference between now and tomorrow morning, and I'd like whatever's left of today. The room was very still. Luca stood slowly. He picked up his phone from the table. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, the same doorway gesture that seemed to run in the Moretti blood, and said, without turning around, did they ever tell you what they were actually after? The full picture? A pause. Some of it. Was Celeste part of it? Another pause. Longer. The robe was Vivian's idea, Eddie said. I heard that secondhand, but yeah, Celeste finding out wasn't an accident. Luca stood in the doorway and absorbed that. He kept his back to the room. She was the exit strategy, Eddie said. If Dante fell apart over his marriage, he'd be distracted. Distracted men make mistakes. That was the theory. Luca walked out without responding. He pulled the door shut behind him, stood in the corridor and leaned his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling for approximately 4 seconds, long enough to let what he'd just heard settle into something manageable. And then he called Dante. Dante was in his car, 3 blocks from the warehouse, when Luca's call came through. He listened without interrupting. When Luca finished, he said, the robe was staged. That's what Eddie said, secondhand, but Vivian put on Celeste's robe because she knew Celeste was coming home early. Yes. Dante's hand tightened on the phone. Not the steering wheel. His hand was off the wheel, because he had pulled to the curb without being aware of deciding to do it. The car idling against a fire hydrant on a street he knew by name, but wasn't seeing. Someone told Vivian the flight schedule. Someone with access to household information, guest Wi-Fi, schedule access, incoming calls. Eddie. Or someone Eddie told. Dante exhaled through his nose. It was not a sound of anger, or not only that. It was the sound a man makes when the full geometry of something becomes clear all at once, and the clarity is worse than the uncertainty had been. Just plant Vivian to steal information, he said. They designed the exit. They needed Celeste out of the house. They needed me. He stopped. Destabilized, Luca said. They needed me to fall apart, Dante said, and they built the detonator out of my wife. The word wife sat in the car with him. He hadn't used it in weeks. It had the texture of something that belonged to a previous version of his life, and using it now, in this context, as the object of a strategy, produced a feeling he didn't have a clean name for. It was past anger. It was in the territory that comes after anger, the territory that is quieter and colder and more permanent. I need to know who told Vivian the flight schedule, he said. I know. Get me that today. Dante. Today, Luca. He ended the call. He sat with the idling car and the fire hydrant and the ordinary Tuesday street, and he thought about Celeste standing in the kitchen doorway with her overnight bag still on her shoulder, and he thought about the calculation he had misread as defiance in Vivian's face, and he thought about how precisely and patiently the whole thing had been built. And by the time he pulled back into traffic, his face was the particular controlled surface that his men had learned, over many years, to be afraid of. The concert was in 7 days. Celeste did not know about Eddie, or about what Luca had found, or about the staged robe, or about any of the machinery that had been running underneath the surface of the event she'd walked through 6 weeks ago in her own kitchen. She knew none of it. She was in the practice room at 7:15 in the morning, working through the Schubert, which was giving her more trouble than the Chopin. The right hand had a passage in the second movement that required a lightness she kept overcorrecting into stiffness. She stopped, shook out her right hand, rolled her wrist twice, started the passage again from the bar before. Better. Not right yet, but better. She had been thinking, in the spaces between practice sessions, about what she wanted the program to say, not the individual pieces, but the arc of it, the emotional shape of 45 minutes of music chosen by a woman who had walked out of a 9-year marriage with a carry-on bag and a grandmother's gold chain. She had not consciously designed the arc, but when she laid the 3 pieces out in sequence, she could hear it. The Chopin first, the loss and the weight of it. The Brahms in the middle, darker and more interior. The Schubert last, which had lightness in it. Not happiness exactly, but the particular brightness that lives on the other side of grief when you've gone all the way through it rather than around it. She had not planned it that way, but the body knows things before the mind admits them. Ruth knocked on the door at 9:30 with the particular knock she used when something required attention. "Someone downstairs to see you," she said. Celeste turned on the bench. "Who?" She said her name is Dana. Celeste blinked. She had not told Dana she'd booked the performance until 4 days ago, and Dana had responded with the text equivalent of a small explosion, all capitals, multiple exclamation points, a voice message that lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds, and that Celeste had listened to twice because she needed to hear that specific variety of uncomplicated joy. She had not, however, told Dana to come. "I drove down this morning," Dana said, appearing in the doorway behind Ruth, who stepped aside with the expression of a woman who has orchestrated a reunion and is pleased with the result. "I wanted to hear you practice." She was wearing a green jacket Celeste recognized from a decade ago and carrying 2 cups of coffee from the place down the street, and she looked at Celeste on the piano bench with an expression that contained the entire history of their sisterhood. Every argument, every late-night phone call, everything said and unsaid between 2 women who had grown up in the same house and arrived at adulthood in very different places. Celeste stood up, and they held each other for a moment without saying anything, which was the right thing to do, and they both knew it. "Play me something," Dana said when they separated. She sat down in the chair in the corner, the one Celeste thought of as Ruth's chair, and wrapped both hands around her coffee and looked at her sister with open, uncomplicated attention. Celeste sat back down. She thought for a moment about which piece. Then she played the Chopin. She played it the way she'd played it the morning everything broke open, the way Ruth had told her not to change. She played it with the grief in it, the whole weight of it, And she did not look at Dana while she played because she needed to be inside the music rather than managing how she appeared to someone watching. She stared at the middle distance above the music stand and let her hands find the piece from the inside. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Dana said, "Celeste, just the name, nothing else." "I know," Celeste said. "That was—" Dana stopped. "Tried again. You've been carrying that the whole time, haven't you? The whole 9 years." Celeste looked at the keys. "I didn't know I was. That's the part that's hard to explain. I thought I'd made peace with it. I thought I was fine." "But you weren't playing." "But I wasn't playing," she agreed. 3 floors below and 6 miles away, Luca Moretti was in a car outside a building in River North, waiting. The building was a converted loft space that housed, on its upper floors, a private wealth management firm with a client list that crossed several different kinds of lines. On the ground floor was a wine bar that served as a semi-public meeting space for the kind of business that couldn't happen in offices, but was too delicate for the back rooms Dante's world usually used. Luca had been waiting for 40 minutes. He had a coffee going cold in the cup holder. He did not drink it. At 11:14, Marco Bellini came out of the building. Luca had seen Bellini before, twice, at the kind of multi-family events where hostile parties maintained civil distance as a professional courtesy. He was 53, gray at the temples, built wide through the shoulders in the way of a man who had been physically imposing in his 30s, and had since allowed the physique to soften without losing its underlying suggestion of force. He walked with the particular ease of a man who moved through the world, confident that the world would adjust to accommodate him. He did not see Luca. He got into an SUV that had been idling at the curb, and it pulled away northward, and Luca watched it go and noted the plate, and noted the time, and noted the name of the man who had come out of the building behind Bellini, a man named Sal Ruggiero, who was Bellini's operational lieutenant, and who had, in the 4 years since Luca had last seen him, grown a beard that did not improve his appearance. Luca picked up his phone and called the number of a man he trusted with the specific kind of trust that had been tested across many years in several genuinely dangerous situations. "I need everything you have on Ruggiero's movements for the past 60 days, he said, "and I need you to flag anything that puts him near our operations, our people, or our properties." "How far back?" 60 days to start. Go further if you find something." "How fast?" Luca looked at the building Bellini had just left. "Yesterday," he said, and ended the call. But the information came back in pieces over the next 18 hours, and each piece made the picture worse. Sal Ruggiero had been in contact, through an intermediary, a lawyer who worked out of an office in the West Loop, with the same accounting firm that had referred Vivian Russo to the Moretti family. The contact had occurred 13 months ago, which placed it 1 month before Eddie's 14-month confession, and suggested an order of operations: identify the inside contact first, then place the asset. They had found Eddie before they placed Vivian. Eddie had been the entry point, not the consequence. Dante looked at this information across the desk from Luca at midnight in the study of the mansion, and what he felt was a species of professional respect that was deeply uncomfortable given its context. This had been built well. The sequencing was careful. The patience was real. Whoever had designed this for Bellini, and Dante was increasingly certain it was not Bellini himself who did not think in sequences, had understood the Moretti organization at a structural level that should not have been possible without direct access. "Who designed this?" Dante said. "Not Ruggiero. He executes. He doesn't architect." "Then who?" Luca was quiet for a moment. He had a folder in front of him that he had not yet opened. He had been carrying it since early evening and had not yet found the right way to put down what was inside it. "When we started looking at Ruggiero's movements," Luca said slowly, "one of the flags that came back was a meeting, 8 months ago. Private dining room at a restaurant in the Gold Coast." He put his hand on the folder but didn't open it. "The restaurant is owned by a holding company. The holding company traces, through 2 intermediaries, to a name we know." Dante looked at this folder. "Open it." Luca opened it and pushed it across the desk. The photograph was taken by a street camera outside the restaurant, time-stamped. 2 men entering through the side door, Sal Ruggiero on the left, recognizable despite the angle. On the right, a man who was heavier than the last time Dante had seen him, who was wearing a coat Dante recognized from a funeral 18 months ago, who had a particular way of holding his right arm slightly away from his body due to an old shoulder injury that Dante had personal knowledge of because he had been present when it occurred. The man in the photograph was Carlo Ferrante, not compromised, not coerced, initiating. Dante looked at the photograph for a long time. He did not touch it. He sat back in his chair and looked at it the way you look at something you have to memorize, because you will need the memory of what you felt in this moment to inform every decision you make afterward. Ferrante had been with the family for 11 years. He had attended Dante's wedding. He had, at various points over those 11 years, been in rooms where the most sensitive information in the Moretti operation was discussed, because he had been trusted with the accounting that underpinned all of it, the legitimate structures and the less legitimate ones. He had been present for the creation of the offshore frameworks that Vivian had subsequently mapped and delivered to Bellini. He had not been a victim of this operation. He had been its architect. "How long?" Dante said. His voice was even. "We don't know yet. The meeting was 8 months ago, but the relationship could be older. We're still pulling. Does he know we've found this?" "No. Nothing we've done should have reached him." Dante nodded. He closed the folder. He stood and walked to the window, the tall window in the study that looked out on the front grounds, the gate, the street beyond, and stood with his hands in his pockets. "Does he have a family?" Dante said. Luca was quiet. "A daughter. She lives in Arizona." Dante nodded. He stood at the window for another. Then, "I want everything. Every document Ferrante has ever handled for us. Every account he had access to. Every meeting he attended. I want to know what Bellini has, what he's been given, and whether any of it can be neutralized before he uses it. And Ferrante himself?" Dante turned from the window. His face had changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious to someone who didn't know him. But Luca knew him. And what Luca saw in his brother's face was not anger, which would have been a relief, because anger was a known quantity. What he saw was something colder and more deliberate. The look of a man who has been betrayed at a depth that does not produce heat, only the slow, absolute settling of a decision. "Bring him in Friday morning," Dante said. "Tell him it's a routine accounting review. Tell him I want to go over the quarterly structure personally. Make it sound like a formality." "He'll know," Luca said. "When he sees you there, he'll know." "Yes," Dante said. "He will." The night before the concert, Celeste could not sleep. She lay in the hotel bed at 2 a.m, with the ceiling above her and the city sounds below, and the particular alertness of a body that has decided sleep is not available. She was not anxious in the way she'd feared she would be, not the performance dread she'd expected, the specific sick-stomach panic of standing alone on a stage in front of 250 people after 19 years of absence. The performance anxiety was there, but it was manageable, almost companion-like, the familiar weight of caring about something enough to be frightened of failing at it. What was keeping her awake was something else, something she hadn't anticipated. She was thinking about the nocturne, about what it said, and what she would be saying by playing it. She was thinking about how public an act this was going to be, not just technically, in the sense of performing in front of an audience, but emotionally, in the sense that anyone who watched her play it and knew anything about what had happened in her life in the past 6 weeks would understand exactly what the music contained. It was not a performance she could separate from her life. It was her life, played out loud. That was terrifying in a way that felt important. The important kind of terrifying. The kind that means you're doing the right thing. She picked up her phone. It was 2:18 in the morning. She looked at her recent calls, Dana's number, Ruth's number, Sandra Holt's. Dante's number, sitting there from 6 weeks ago, the last call she hadn't answered. She put the phone down. She thought about calling Dana but didn't, because Dana had a 7-year-old who had school in the morning. She thought about calling Ruth, who would probably answer at 2 in the morning because Ruth seemed to operate on a schedule that bore little relation to normal human rhythms. But she didn't call her either. She just lay there and thought about the music. She thought about the Schubert, the last piece, the one she'd chosen for the end, the brightness on the other side of grief. She hadn't played it yet the way she wanted to, hadn't fully found it, the way she'd found the Chopin. She'd been close, but there was something in the final movement that she kept approaching and then pulling back from, someplace she needed to go that she hadn't yet permitted herself. She thought about why she was pulling back. She lay in the dark and examined it honestly. The way she'd been trying to examine things honestly since she walked out of the mansion with a carry-on bag and started paying for her own coffee for the first time in 9 years. The Schubert's brightness required the loss to be complete. It required her to have actually let go of what she was grieving, not just named it. And the question she'd been avoiding in the back rooms of her own mind was, had she? Had she actually let Dante go, or was she still holding the shape of him, the familiar weight of what he had been in her life, even if what he'd been was insufficient and finally destructive? She lay with that question until 3:15, when she fell asleep without answering it. The Friday morning meeting was called for 9 o'clock. Carlo Ferrante arrived at 8:53, which was his habit. Always early enough to feel prepared, never so early as to seem eager. He was wearing his usual gray suit, carrying the leather briefcase he'd carried to every meeting Dante could remember, and he walked through the warehouse entrance the way he always did, with the comfortable familiarity of a man who belonged there. He stopped when he saw Dante sitting at the head of the table. The stop lasted approximately 1 second. 1 second in which his body understood the room before his mind had finished processing the visual information. In that 1 second, something moved across his face that was too fast and too small for most people to catch. Luca caught it. Dante caught it. Ferrante recovered. He continued walking to his usual chair. He set his briefcase on the table. He looked at Dante with an expression that was professionally warm and entirely constructed. "Dante," he said, "I didn't expect you personally. Sit down, Carlo." He sat. Luca was at the far end of the table, and there were 2 other men in the room, positioned, not seated, near the door. Ferrante's eyes moved to them briefly and moved away. His hands rested on the table, one on top of the other, and they were steady, which told Dante something about the man's nerve that he filed away without changing expression. "We've been going through the quarterly structure," Dante said. "Like I said." "Of course." Ferrante opened his briefcase. "I brought the—" "We found the meeting," Dante said. Ferrante's hands stopped. They were inside the open briefcase, not yet on anything, and they simply stopped. He did not look up immediately. He looked at the inside of the briefcase for approximately 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds Luca watched him make a decision, watched the internal calculation play across the minute tension of his jaw and the set of his shoulders. And then Ferrante sat back and put his hands on the table and looked at Dante. "Which meeting?" he said. Not a denial, a request for the scope. "The Gold Coast, 8 months ago, Ruggiero." Ferrante nodded very slowly. He looked at his hands. He looked at Dante. His face had gone through the performance layer and arrived at something more genuine underneath. Not remorse, not fear exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has been maintaining a complicated structure for a long time and has just been told he can stop. "How long?" Dante said. "Longer than 8 months. The room was absolutely still. "How long, Carlo?" Ferrante looked at Dante for a long moment. 3 years, he said. 3 years. The number moved through the room without anyone saying anything. 3 years meant the offshore structures that Dante had built with Ferrante's help, the ones he had trusted Ferrante to design and protect, had been visible to Bellini for 3 years. 3 years of exposure. 3 years of decisions made without knowing who was watching. Dante sat very still. He looked at Ferrante with the expression he'd been wearing since the photograph, the one that was not anger and not grief, but the cold, settled thing that lives below both of them. "Why?" he said. Ferrante looked at the table. "My daughter." He said it quietly. There was a situation 3 years ago. A debt. I went to Bellini because I didn't feel I could come to you. I thought I could contain it. I thought it would be one conversation, one favor." He exhaled. "You know how these things go." "I do," Dante said. "I know exactly how they go, Carlo, which is why I want you to understand what you've given him, what 3 years looks like." Ferrante said nothing. "The offshore accounts," Dante said. "The account structures in the Cayman instruments. The reserve positions. The quarterly movement patterns. The names attached to the legitimate holdings. Everything you built for us over 11 years. You gave him the keys to all of it." Ferrante closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something in his face was different. Not relieved, but the way a room looks when a window is finally opened. "Not everything," he said. I protected some of it. There were things I refused to give him. Like what? Names. The family names, the people, not the accounts. I gave him the financial architecture. I never gave him the people. Dante looked at him for a long time. I was looking for the lie in it. He examined it from several angles, the way he examined everything, and what he found was that it might be true, that Ferrante had drawn a line somewhere in his 3 years of betrayal and had held to it, which was either genuine conscience or the specific math of a man who understood that giving up family names crossed a threshold from financial crime to something that left no way back. It didn't matter. The damage was done either way. Is there anything in what you've given him that he hasn't used yet? Dante said. Ferrante was quiet for a moment. There's something he's been holding, he said. I gave it to him 6 months ago. He hasn't moved on it yet, which means he's waiting for the right moment. He looked at Dante. It's the Calumet account. The full structure. If he files what I gave him with the right authority, and he has the contacts. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The Calumet account was not just a financial instrument. It was the central node of the Moretti family's legitimate business holdings, the structure through which everything flowed, the legal tissue that made the entire enterprise viable. If Bellini delivered what Ferrante had given him to a federal authority, it would not just expose the Moretti finances. It would dismantle them, systematically, publicly, permanently. Dante sat in the room with that information and let it settle into the ground floor of his understanding. Bellini wasn't trying to destabilize the Moretti family. He was trying to end it. The personal operation, Eddie, Vivian, the staged scene in the kitchen, Celeste walking out. That had been the distraction. The thing designed to keep Dante looking inward, at his marriage, at his grief, at the personal wreckage, while the real weapon was positioned. He had been looking at the wrong thing for 6 weeks. When is he planning to move? Dante said. I don't know the exact timing, Ferrante said. But there's a window, a regulatory filing deadline. If he's going to use it through proper channels, he has to act within 60 days of when he received the full documentation. Which was 6 months ago. Yes. Dante looked at Luca. Luca's face confirmed the math they were both doing simultaneously. They had less than a month. Dante stood. He buttoned his jacket with the methodical precision of a man performing a familiar ritual to give his hands something to do while his mind did the actual work. He looked at Ferrante one final time, at the gray suit, the leather briefcase, the hands resting on the table with their terrible steadiness. And what he felt was something he had not expected to feel, which was a specific variety of sorrow. Not for Ferrante, or not only. For the 11 years. For what competence looks like when it has been divided against itself and used against the people who trusted it. Take his phone, Dante said to Luca, and walked out of the room for the second time that week. I was in his car, driving without a destination, when the thought arrived fully formed and undeniable. Bellini had a month's window, and Dante's entire legitimate holding structure was exposed. And there was exactly one person in the city whose financial and legal understanding of the Moretti accounts was complete enough to help him rebuild the architecture fast enough to close the exposure before Bellini moved. That person was Vivian Russo, who was still free, who was still in contact with Bellini's network, who did not yet know that Ferrante had given her up, or that Eddie had confirmed the robe, or that the entire operation had been unraveled from the inside with the slow patience of a thread pulled from a sweater until the whole garment came apart. Dante pulled over. He sat with the engine running. Vivian knew where the bodies were buried, financially speaking, because she had put them there. She understood the Calumet structure at a depth that Luca did not, and that Dante himself only partially did, because she had been brought in specifically for her expertise and had spent 14 months learning the architecture that Ferrante had built and then betrayed. Using Vivian to close Bellini's window meant bringing her in. It meant sitting across from the woman who had stood in his kitchen in his wife's robe and choosing, deliberately, to need something from her. It meant the specific humiliation of requiring the instrument of his personal destruction to prevent his professional one. It also meant she would know they'd found everything. And a person who knew they'd been found, who was still in contact with the opposition, was a person who could burn everything down in the 12 hours between learning they'd been caught and the moment Dante could contain the fallout. He sat in the car for a long time, then he called Luca. I need Vivian Russo, he said. Today, quietly. Bring her somewhere she can't make a call. A pause. Dante. She's the only one who can walk us through the Calumet exposure fast enough to close it before Bellini moves. We have no other option. And if she talks before we get to her? Then we're finished anyway, Dante said, so we might as well move. He ended the call and sat in the car and looked at the street ahead of him, and what he understood, sitting there in the specific silence of a man who has just run out of the luxury of good options, was that the version of himself that had managed his empire from a position of control and patience and strategic advantage was gone, and what was left was something rawer and more desperate than he had allowed himself to be in a very long time, and the only way through it was forward, without the comfort of knowing how it ended. Vivian Russo was in her apartment on the 14th floor of a building in Streeterville when Luca's men came for her. She had been expecting something. Not this specifically. Not two men in the elevator, not the particular knock that was too controlled to be casual, but something. She had been expecting the edges to close in for 2 days, ever since she'd sat across from Peter Vance at the coffee shop on Dearborn, and seen in his face a quality of urgency that was different from the operational calm he usually maintained. He had told her to be ready to move. He had not told her what to move meant. She did not run when she opened the door. Running would have been useless, and she knew it. And Vivian Russo did not do useless things. She looked at the two men in the hallway. She knew one of them, Caruso, who had been at the mansion during her time there, and she held the door open and said, "Give me 5 minutes to put on shoes." Caruso looked at her. 2 minutes, he said. She nodded and went to get her shoes, which told Caruso something about her that he relayed to Luca in a text message while she was in the other room. She's calm, prepared. She came back with shoes and a jacket and her phone, and Caruso held out his hand for the phone. She gave it to him without argument. That told him the rest. They brought her to a property on the northwest side, a house the Moretti family used for various purposes that required privacy and the absence of cameras, which this block provided due to its particular combination of age, residential density, and the fact that 2 of the streetlights had been not quite working for as long as anyone could remember. The house was warm inside, which Vivian registered with the part of her brain that registered environmental information as a matter of professional habit. Someone had prepared this space. Someone had anticipated the need for it. Dante was already there when she arrived. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his jacket on and his hands folded, and the specific stillness she recognized from the months she'd worked with him. The stillness that meant he had moved past the part where emotion was useful and arrived at the part where only precision mattered. She sat down across from him without being told to. They looked at each other for a moment. It was the first time they'd been in the same room since the morning she'd watched him walk past her in the sitting room without stopping the day after Celeste had left. She had spent some portion of the week since then thinking about what this meeting would look like when it came, and now that it was here, she found it was both exactly what she'd expected and nothing like it. "We found Ferrante," Dante said. She absorbed that. Her expression didn't change significantly, but her breathing shifted. A fraction of a second's pause, barely perceptible. "When?" "This morning." "He told you about the Calumet structure?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. She looked at the table surface. She was doing math. Dante could see it, the rapid internal accounting of what he knew versus what he could prove versus what she had remaining to protect or trade. "You need me," she said. It was not a question, and she didn't phrase it with satisfaction. She said it the way you state a structural fact about a building, load-bearing, non-negotiable, requiring acknowledgement before anything else could be built. "Bellini has a window of less than 30 days, Dante said. "The Calumet exposure needs to be restructured before he moves. You know that architecture better than anyone alive who is currently on my side of this table." She looked at him. "And what side of this table am I on?" "That's what we're deciding." She leaned back in her chair. She crossed her arms, not defensively, but the posture of a woman who is settling in for a technical conversation that requires precision. "I want something in writing," she said. "Before I say anything else, immunity. From you and from anything downstream of you." "You'll get something." "That's not what I said." "What you'll get is my word," Dante said, which in this context is the same as writing, and we both know it. She looked at him for a long moment. She was assessing whether that was true, whether his word, in a situation this personal, still held the weight it held in ordinary professional circumstances. She was assessing whether a man who had just discovered that she had staged a scene designed to destroy his marriage would honor a commitment to her. "You want to know if I'll keep my word to someone who did what you did," Dante said. "Yes." "The answer is yes. Not because I've forgiven anything. I haven't. But because you're useful right now, and I don't burn useful things for the satisfaction of it. That's Bellini's style, not mine." Something in her face shifted. It was not relief. She was too controlled for relief, but something adjacent. The particular relaxation of a person who has been holding a question and has received an answer they can work with. "The Calumet structure has 7 layers, she said. "Bellini has documentation on 4 of them from Ferrante. The outer 3 are what he's going to use. They're the most visible to a regulatory authority, the easiest to present. The inner 4 are more complex, and he probably doesn't fully understand what he has." "Can the outer 3 be restructured before he moves?" "Not restructured, collapsed and rebuilt. It would take," she paused, calculating, "72 hours of continuous work. New instruments, new holding entities, new account structures that don't match what he has documentation for." "Who does the work?" "Me and your best accountant, who isn't Ferrante." "Done." Dante stood. "We start in 2 hours. I'm getting the materials from the warehouse." "There's something else," Vivian said. He stopped, looked at her. "Bellini has a contingency," she said. "If his primary window closes, if you restructure before he can move, he has a secondary play. It's not financial, it's personal." She held his gaze. "I don't know the full details, but I know it involves something he can use against you directly, something that makes the financial exposure look like a secondary concern." The room was very quiet. "What kind of personal?" Dante said. "The kind that a man spends his whole career making sure no one can find, and then one day someone finds it." She paused. "I'm not trying to manage you. I'm telling you what I know because if his primary play fails and he goes to the secondary one, we're both in a worse position." Dante looked at her for a long time. He was reading her, the way he read everyone, the deep habitual scan for the angle, the self-interest, the thing behind the thing. What he found was that she was telling the truth, or the version of the truth she had access to, which was not the same thing but was close enough to act on. "Find out what you can about the secondary play while we work," he said. "Luca will get you a clean phone. Use it only for that." She nodded. He walked out. 2 hours later, in a separate room of the same house, Vivian Russo sat across a table from a man named Dom Agosto, 51, quiet, meticulous in the manner of a person for whom precision was not a professional skill but a personality trait. And they began the process of dismantling and rebuilding a 7-layer financial architecture against a 30-day clock. Dante stayed for the first hour, watching without speaking, understanding perhaps 30% of what was being discussed, and trusting that the 30% was sufficient for him to monitor without interfering with the 70% that required expertise he didn't have. At the end of the first hour, he was satisfied that the work was real, that Vivian was not managing him, was not constructing a fiction, was genuinely and with visible technical investment working through the problem in front of her, and he left them to it. He went to find Luca. Luca was in the front room with 2 phones and the particular tightly controlled energy of a man who had been receiving bad news at intervals and processing it without visible deterioration. "Tell me," Dante said. "Bellini moved up his timeline." Dante sat down. "How do you know?" "Ruggiero made 3 calls this morning that we picked up through the number we've been monitoring. 1 to a contact in Washington, 1 to the Miami holding company, 1 to a name we haven't fully identified yet. The call was short, less than 90 seconds, and the number routes through a relay." Luca set one of the phones on the table between them. "He's not waiting 30 days, he's moving in 72 hours. The coincidence of the number was not lost on either of them. 72 hours to rebuild the structure. 72 hours until Bellini moved. "He knows we found Ferrante," Dante said. "Either that, or he was always planning to move faster, and the 30-day window was misdirection. Either way, we have the same problem." Dante looked at the phone on the table. "What about the secondary play? The personal one Vivian mentioned?" "I've been working on that. The Washington contact Ruggiero called. I have a name now. Federal, not local. A career prosecutor who has been building a case on organized crime structures in the Midwest for the past 4 years. Luca paused. And she has a source we didn't know about. Inside our organization? Inside our organization, Luca confirmed. Not Eddie, not Ferrante. Someone we haven't identified yet. Dante looked at his brother. He looked at the controlled surface of Luca's face and saw underneath it the same thing he felt in himself. The specific vertigo of discovering that the breach was deeper than you thought, that the bottom was further down than the last time you checked. How many people knew about the accounts that are being rebuilt right now? Dante said. The ones that matter? Before today? Luca held up 4 fingers. He folded them down one at a time. Ferrante, you, me, and whoever Ferrante told. So not a current inside source, historical, Ferrante's 3 years of access. Unless, Luca stopped. Unless what? Unless it's not about accounts. The personal play Vivian mentioned, a prosecutor building a case on organized crime doesn't just need financial records. She needs testimony. She needs someone who was in the room. Luca looked at his brother. Someone who has been in a lot of rooms over a lot of years. Dante sat with that. He ran through the list of people who had been in enough rooms to constitute a meaningful source for a career prosecutor. The dinners, the planning sessions, the moments where operational decisions had been made in the presence of more people than strictly necessary, because he had once operated on the assumption that the people in those rooms were unimpeachably his. We need to lock down anyone with that kind of access, Dante said. Not threaten, locate. I want to know where everyone is. That's 30-odd people. Start with the 10 closest. I'll give you the list. I was writing the list in his head when his phone rang. Not the secure phone Luca had given him for operational calls. His personal phone. The number on the screen was one he hadn't seen in 6 weeks, and the sight of it produced in him a physical sensation, somewhere between his sternum and his stomach, a tightening that was not entirely unpleasant and was entirely inconvenient. Celeste. He looked at the phone for 2 rings. He was in the middle of the worst operational crisis his family had faced in 15 years. He had 72 hours to restructure a financial architecture, identify an unknown insider source, and neutralize a federal evidence threat, all simultaneously. He answered, Celeste. His voice came out differently than he intended. Not controlled, not strategic, just the flat open sound of someone who had not expected to feel what they were feeling. A pause on her end. He could hear ambient sound. Not the hotel, somewhere different, more acoustic. I'm performing tonight, she said. He said nothing. I don't know why I'm calling you, she continued. Her voice was even but not without effort. I wasn't going to, and then I picked up the phone and called you, so… A pause. I'm not asking you to come. I'm not asking you for anything. I just… She stopped. Started again. I needed you to know. For some reason, I needed you to know that I'm doing this. The room around him, the Northwest Side house, Luca in the next room, the 2 accountants building a new financial architecture against a countdown. All of it was still there, but it had moved to a different register. He was aware of it the way you're aware of weather outside a window. Present, real, demanding eventual attention, while something more immediate held the foreground. I know, he said. I've known for a few days. Another pause. Of course you have. Celeste, I'm not angry about it, she said. I don't have the energy to be angry about it right now. I just needed… She exhaled. I'll be fine. I know I'll be fine. I just wanted someone to know who… She didn't finish that sentence. He understood what the unfinished sentence contained. Someone who knew what this meant. Someone who understood the full distance between the woman who had locked that piano in a storage unit at 22 and the woman standing backstage at a concert venue at 41, about to walk out and play it in front of 250 people. You'll be extraordinary, he said. It came out simply, without performance. He meant it. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing. I'll be imperfect, she said. But I think that's okay. Yes, he said. That's better than extraordinary. Another silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who know each other at a depth that cannot be entirely destroyed by what has happened between them, sitting in that knowledge without doing anything with it. Okay, she said finally. Okay. That's all I needed. She paused. Take care of yourself, Dante. She ended the call. He sat with the phone in his hand for about 4 seconds. Then he set it down and picked up the operational phone and went back to the list. The concert was at 8 o'clock. Celeste stood in the wings at 7:53 in a dark blue dress she'd bought herself the previous week. Not expensive in the way her wardrobe had been expensive for 9 years, but right in the way that only things you choose for yourself are right. And she listened to the audience settling into their seats through the side monitor and felt the specific temperature of the moment. Her hands were cold. They were always cold before she played, had been since high school, a physiological response to adrenaline that she'd learned to work with rather than against. She flexed her fingers slowly, one hand and then the other, and breathed. Ruth was beside her. She had not said anything in the last 5 minutes, which was the right choice. Dana was in the third row on the left side. Celeste had seen her through the gap in the curtain, green jacket, already leaning forward with the focused intensity of someone who arrived early and prepared to pay attention. Sandra Holt appeared briefly to confirm the running order and disappeared again. Celeste breathed. She thought about the phone call. She had not planned to make it, and now that it was past, she examined her reasons for making it with the same honesty she'd been applying to everything in the past 6 weeks. She had called him because she needed a witness, someone who understood the specific weight of what she was about to do and could hold the knowledge of it. She had not called him out of weakness or residual attachment or the desire to pull him back. She had called him because he was, despite everything, one of the few people on earth who knew what this cost her. That was not nothing, but it was also not enough. Not anywhere close to enough. Sandra Holt's voice came through the monitor, introducing the program, and Celeste felt the particular stillness arrive that always came in the final seconds before she had to move. The stillness that was not calm, but was its functional equivalent, the focused quiet of a body that has decided to stop managing the situation and simply enter it. She walked out. The applause when she appeared was polite and welcoming. She sat at the Steinway, a concert grand, impeccably maintained, nothing like the slightly imperfect instrument in Ruth's studio, and adjusted the bench and looked at the keys and heard the audience settle into the particular quality of attention that precedes a performance. She put her hands on the keys. She played the Chopin. She played it the way she'd played it the morning. Everything broke open in the practice room, with the grief in it, the whole weight, the full admission of what had been lost and what it felt like to lose it. She did not perform it. She played it, which is a different thing, and the difference was audible from the first 4 bars to every person in that room who had ever experienced a genuine emotion and recognized the sound of someone else doing the same. The house was completely still. She played the Brahms. Darker, more interior, the piece that moved through the grief rather than stating it, the middle passage of the program, the necessary descent before the return. And then she played the Schubert. She had not found it fully in practice, had been approaching it and pulling back from the final movement, the brightness that required the loss to be complete. She sat at the beginning of it and felt the question she'd been carrying since 2 in the morning 4 nights ago. Had she let go, or was she still holding the shape of what she'd lost? She played the first movement, the second, and then she arrived at the third, the final movement, the brightness. And she felt the answer to the question arrive not as a thought, but as something that happened in her hands. The way the deepest truths arrive, not through reasoning, but through the body, through the accumulated knowledge of living, through the moment when you stop asking and simply do. She played it, all of it. She let it be light. Not easy. Nothing about it was easy, but genuinely, honestly, earned light. The light that exists on the other side of grief when you've gone all the way through it, without flinching, without detour, without the comfortable numbness of pretending it isn't as heavy as it is. She played the final bars and lifted her hands from the keys. The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds. The specific silence of an audience that has received something real and needs a moment to understand what it has been given. Then the applause started. It was not polite applause. It was the kind that begins in the front rows and moves backward through a room like something physical. People on their feet before they'd consciously decided to stand. Dana in the third row with her hands together above her head. Ruth at the side of the house with her arms crossed and her chin tilted up at the particular angle of a person who is doing their absolute best not to cry in public. Celeste sat at the piano and looked at her hands in her lap. She had played imperfectly. There was a phrase in the Brahms where her timing had slipped slightly. The Chopin's middle section had been a fraction slower than she'd intended. The Schubert's second movement had been uneven in places. She had played imperfectly, and it had been true, and true was better. Backstage afterward, she shook hands with Sandra Holt and accepted a hug from Dana that lasted a long time and said more than either of them needed to put into words. Ruth appeared and stood beside her with a cup of water and said only, "That was the Schubert I told you to play," which meant, "You found it," and Celeste understood. People came backstage in small numbers. The Civic Arts Foundation board members, a few audience members who'd asked permission, a music critic from a local publication who introduced himself and asked if she'd be willing to speak for 10 minutes, and Celeste said yes, and the conversation that followed was the first time she'd spoken publicly about music in almost 20 years, and it was not difficult, and that surprised her. She was still talking to the critic when she felt something change in the room, not dramatically, not loudly, but she had spent 9 years in a world where the presence of certain people altered the atmospheric pressure of whatever space they entered, and she felt it before she saw it. The slight reconfiguration of the people around her, the almost imperceptible shift of attention. She turned. Dante was standing at the entrance to the backstage area. He was not in his usual suit. He looked like a man who had come from somewhere else, somewhere that had required more from him than a concert, which was true. He was slightly disheveled in a way she had never seen him in public, the jacket open, the jaw unshaved by a day, a quality of exhaustion around his eyes that was not performance. He had come. She had told him she wasn't asking him to come, and he had come anyway, and she stood and looked at him from across the backstage room and felt the complicated arithmetic of it. What it meant, what it didn't mean, what she was going to do with the fact that he was here. She excused herself from the music critic. She walked across the room. They stood face to face for the first time since a morning 6 weeks ago when she had walked up a flight of stairs without saying a word to the woman standing in her kitchen. "You came," she said. "I came," he said. His voice was quiet. Not strategic quiet, just quiet. She looked at him. She took in the exhaustion, the dishevelment, the quality of a man who was in the middle of something significant that had nothing to do with this room and had come here anyway. She had always been good at reading him, had read him correctly for years and done nothing useful with the information, which was a different kind of failure than his, her failure. "You look terrible," she said. "I know." "Is everything—" She stopped herself. It was not her business anymore, or it was not yet clear what was her business and what wasn't, and she wasn't going to make decisions about that in a backstage room at a concert she had just played. "I'm handling it," he said, which meant, yes, things are very bad, and I'm in the middle of them, and I'm still here. She looked at him for another moment. "The Schubert was very good," he said. "The last movement." "You were in the audience?" "The back row," he said. "I came in after you started. I didn't want you to see me and—" He paused. "I didn't want it to be about me being there." She absorbed that. She looked at his face and looked at what was in it. Not the performance, not the management, not the careful, composed surface she'd looked at across dinner tables for 9 years. Just the face of a man who was standing in a room where he hadn't been invited, having come because he needed to, in the middle of a crisis that was not her problem, to tell her that her Schubert was very good. It was not enough. Not nearly enough. Not even close. But it was real. And real was what she had started demanding from everything. And she felt the weight of that reality settle into the complicated place inside her where she kept the things she hadn't yet decided what to do with. "Go handle your crisis," she said. He looked at her. "Is that all?" "For tonight," she said. "That's all for tonight." He nodded. He started to turn. "Dante." He stopped. "Thank you for coming," she said. Not warmly. Honestly. There was a difference. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he walked out. I was back in the car and on the operational phone before he'd reached the end of the block. "Tell me," he said to Luca. Vivian found the secondary play. Luca's voice was tight. "It's not a federal source. It's not testimony. Bellini has a recording." Dante's hand tightened on the phone. "Of what?" "Of a conversation. 18 months ago. The dinner meeting where the 2 out-of-state associates were present. The one Vivian sent the summary of. She didn't just send a summary, Dante. She was recording the whole time, and the recording has you on it, specifically, discussing the Calumet account by name and its connection to Luca stopped. Connection to what, Luca? To the Harmon Street operation, Luca said, by name, in your voice. The Harmon Street operation was not a financial matter. It was something older, something from 8 years ago, something that had been resolved in ways that did not have the kind of resolution that could be explained to a federal prosecutor. The recording, if delivered to the right person with the right context, was not just a financial threat. It was a personal one, in the oldest and most irreversible sense. Dante sat in the car and felt the full weight of it arrive. Not in pieces, not sequentially, but all at once. The complete picture. The 72-hour window to restructure the financial architecture. The recording that could end not just his operation, but his freedom. And Bellini sitting somewhere in this city with both weapons ready and the patience to use them in sequence. "Where's the recording?" he said. "We think it's with Ruggiero. He's been moving. We lost him 2 hours ago." "Find him." "Dante. Find him tonight, Luca." His voice was not loud. It had gone past loud into the quieter register of someone who has nothing left to lose by being direct. "Whatever it takes. We do not have another option. Find Ruggiero, get the recording, and neutralize it before Bellini can deliver it. If we lose that window—" "I know," Luca said. "How many men do we have available?" "Enough." "Then use them." Dante looked at the street ahead of him. The city at 9:30 on a Friday, people outside restaurants, taxi lights. The ordinary brightness of a metropolis that did not know what was happening inside any of the cars moving through it. And Luca— "Yeah." "The accountants. Are they done with the first 3 layers?" 2 of 7. Vivian says 48 more hours for the rest." "She doesn't have 48. She has 36. Tell her that." He ended the call and drove north through the city with both hands on the wheel and the operational phone on his thigh and his personal phone silent in his jacket pocket. And he thought about Celeste's face in the backstage room. The honest, clear, complicated face of a woman who had decided to demand reality from everything and was applying that standard to him too. And he thought about what it would cost to be the thing she was demanding, and whether he was capable of it, and whether capability was even the right frame for the question. And he drove, and the city moved past the windows. And somewhere in the northwest of it, Sal Ruggiero was in motion with a recording that could end everything. And somewhere in the south, Marco Bellini was sitting with his hands folded and his contingencies aligned. And somewhere in a house on the near west side, 2 accountants and a woman who had helped destroy his marriage were racing the clock to rebuild the financial architecture of a family that had stood for 30 years. And Dante Moretti drove through the middle of all of it with his jaw set and his hands steady, and the full understanding that the next 36 hours would determine not just his empire, but the version of himself that came out the other side, if anything came out the other side, and that the version he wanted to be was one he had not yet fully earned. He pressed the accelerator and drove north and did not look back, and the city opened up ahead of him, indifferent and necessary and entirely unaware that it was holding its breath. They found Sal Ruggiero at 11:47 at night in the parking structure of a hotel in the South Loop. He was not alone. He had 2 men with him, which Luca had anticipated, and Luca had brought 4, which was the math he'd calculated in the car on the way over. The structure was 3 levels underground, cold with the particular damp cold of enclosed concrete spaces, lit by fluorescent strips that gave everything the greenish pallor of something that should not be seen this clearly. Luca did not want a firefight in a hotel parking structure. Firefights produce noise, witnesses, and the kind of aftermath that required weeks of management and left marks in databases that never fully went away. He wanted the recording. He wanted Ruggiero's phone and whatever backup device he was carrying and whatever cloud access could be severed before morning. He wanted all of it, and he wanted it without leaving the kind of evidence that would give the federal prosecutor something new to work with. He had 7 minutes before the hotel's private security did their next circuit of the structure. The 2 men with Ruggiero were positioned badly, one near the elevator, one near the stairwell, which suggested Ruggiero had planned for someone coming from a single direction and had not considered the possibility of both simultaneously. Luca's 4 men came from both. The confusion lasted about 40 seconds, which was longer than Luca would have preferred, but shorter than it could have been. And at the end of it, Ruggiero was against a concrete pillar with Luca's hand on his collar and a quality of attention on Luca's face that Ruggiero, who had been in several genuinely dangerous situations over the course of his career, recognized as the specific kind that required cooperation. "The phone," Luca said. Not loud. very clear. Ruggiero was breathing hard. He was heavier than he looked in photographs, and the 40 seconds of controlled chaos had cost him physically in a way it hadn't cost Luca, who was younger and had spent the past 6 weeks in a state of sustained operational tension that had, as a side effect, kept him extremely alert. "You don't want to do this," Ruggiero said. "I already did it," Luca said. "The phone." Ruggiero looked at him with the calculating eyes of a man running out of calculations. He reached slowly into his left jacket pocket and produced a phone. Luca took it, handed it behind him without looking. "All of them," he said to Ruggiero. A pause. Then the second phone, from the inside breast pocket. "The backup," Luca said. "There isn't—" Luca's grip on his collar tightened by a fraction. Not dramatically. Just enough to convey that he had done the math on this, and the math included the backup device that anyone running an operation of this sensitivity would carry. Ruggiero reached into his right trouser pocket and produced a small encrypted drive. Luca took it. He stepped back. He looked at Ruggiero for a moment with the steady, unheated expression of a man who has obtained what he came for and is now deciding what comes next. "Bellini's primary window closes tomorrow morning when the restructuring files," Luca said. "You can tell him that or not. Either way, the recording is gone. The financial documentation he has is documentation for accounts that will cease to exist by 6 a.m. He paused. "And if he goes to the secondary play after that, if he finds another version of this that I haven't anticipated, I want you to explain to him that I will spend whatever it takes, for however long it takes, to ensure that his operation does not survive the attempt. That's not a threat. That's a forecast." Ruggiero said nothing. Luca turned and walked toward the stairwell. His 4 men fell in around him. Behind them, Ruggiero stood against the concrete pillar with the 2 men who had come with him, both of whom were making the careful, neutral faces of people who have witnessed something they intend to remember very little of. At the stairwell door, Luca stopped. He turned back. "One more thing," he said. "The woman who was placed in the Moretti household, Vivian Russo, she cooperated with us. Bellini should know that, so he doesn't spend energy wondering." He paused. "And so he knows that the people he trusted to hold this together didn't." He pushed through the stairwell door and was gone. "What?" At 4:23 in the morning, Dom Agosto set down his pen and looked across the table at Vivian Russo, who was leaning back in her chair with her eyes closed and the particular stillness of someone who has passed through exhaustion and arrived at something on the other side of it. "Third layer is done," he said. She opened her eyes. "Run it back through the instrument chain. Make sure the account numbers don't sequentially follow the old structure." He ran it back. He found 2 sequential numbers that needed correction. He corrected them. He ran it again. "Good," she said. 4, 5, and 6 are going to take until at least 5:30, he said. "Then it's 5:30. She sat up. She picked up the cold coffee from beside her laptop and drank it without appearing to notice it was cold. "The 7th layer is the most complex. I'll need to walk you through the instrument logic on that one personally. You've been awake for—" "I know how long I've been awake," she said. "Keep going." He kept going. At 5:51, with the first gray light beginning to appear in the high, narrow windows of the house's eastern wall, Vivian typed the final confirmation on the 7th layer restructuring and sat back and looked at the screen. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the way a surgeon probably feels after a long, high-stakes procedure, wrung out in a specific way, the particular depletion that comes from sustained precision under pressure. She felt the satisfaction of technical completion, and underneath it the less clean feeling of everything else. What she had been, what she had done, what she had spent the last 14 hours doing in the opposite direction. She closed the laptop. She looked at the window. "Is it enough?" Dom Agosto asked. "If they move before 6, yes," she said. "After 6, it doesn't matter. The old structures won't exist anymore. Whatever documentation Bellini has is documentation for accounts that aren't there." "And the recording?" She looked at him. "That's not mine to answer." At 6:04, Luca called Dante. "It's done," he said. "Both pieces." Dante was already awake. He had been awake since 3, sitting in the study of the mansion with the lights on and the operational phone on the desk, and the particular quality of alertness that comes from knowing the next several hours will be either the beginning of recovery or the end of everything. He had not slept. He had drunk 3 cups of coffee and looked at the photograph on his desk, the one Luca had taken from the warehouse files weeks ago of the offshore account structure before Ferrante began his 3 years of careful demolition, and thought about what it meant to rebuild something from inside a breach. Both pieces, he said. The restructuring filed at 5:58. Ruggiero's devices are destroyed. The recording is gone. A pause. Bellini has nothing left to move with. Dante exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale. It was the quiet release of a man who has been holding his chest in a particular configuration for 36 hours and has just been told he can let it go. Ferrante, he said. Handled, Luca said. His daughter doesn't know. She won't. Keep it that way. A pause. Eddie? A longer pause. Also handled. Dante nodded at the empty study. And Vivian? She's here. She wants to know what happens now. He thought about it. He thought about what she had done, the full account of it, the staged scene, the 14 months of information extraction, the careful use of his personal life as operational cover. And he thought about what she had done in the past 36 hours, which was real and technically brilliant, and had saved what was left of everything he'd built. He held both of those facts simultaneously and examined what he actually thought about it, not what he was supposed to think. Give her the immunity she asked for, he said, in writing, this time, and give her 60 days to get out of the city. After that, he paused. After that, she's on her own. That's more than she deserves, Luca said. Probably, Dante said. Do it anyway. He ended the call. He sat in the study for another few minutes in the early morning quiet. Then he stood and went to the kitchen and made himself breakfast for the first time in weeks. Eggs, toast, the ordinary mechanical comfort of doing something with his hands that didn't require strategy. And he ate standing at the counter and looked out the kitchen window at the grounds and the gate and the street beyond, and he thought about all the things that were now different and all the things that were not going to change just because the crisis had passed. And he thought about Celeste on the stage the night before, her hands on the keys, her face turned toward the middle distance above the music stand. He washed his plate. He put it away. He went upstairs and slept for 4 hours. 3 months passed. Not quietly. Nothing in that period was exactly quiet, because dismantling the consequences of a 3-year intelligence breach does not happen in a week or a month, and the reconstruction of trust inside an organization that has discovered multiple simultaneous betrayals is slow work that requires patience of a different order than the patience required for operational decisions. Dante did that work. He did it without shortcuts and without the kind of performance of reform that substitutes for the actual thing. He reduced the size of his inner circle to a number small enough to monitor. He restructured the legitimate business holdings, the shipping company, the 3 commercial properties, the consulting firm, with a cleaner separation between their functions than had existed before. He had several conversations with people who had been in rooms where they shouldn't have been, and those conversations were honest in ways that the previous version of him would have found unnecessarily exposing. He was a worse poker player than he'd been before, in the sense that he had become less interested in maintaining surfaces that didn't correspond to anything underneath them. Luca noticed this first. He didn't say anything about it for 2 weeks, and then one evening in the office he said, "You're different." Dante looked at him. "Different how?" "Quieter," Luca said. "But not the quiet you used to be. That quiet was managed. This is something else." Dante thought about it. "I think I stopped being interested in managing how things appear," he said. "It costs too much, and it doesn't hold." Luca looked at his brother for a moment. "Celeste," he said. Not a question. "Partly," Dante said. "Not entirely." The Bellini situation resolved itself in the particular way that situations resolve when one party runs out of weapons and the other party declines to pursue advantage beyond the point of security. Bellini was not destroyed. That was neither practical nor, Dante had decided, necessary. He was contained. The channels through which he'd operated against the Moretti family were closed. The intermediaries were gone. The relationship between the two families returned to the cold, professional distance of organizations that understood each other's capacity for damage and had decided that mutual restraint was more useful than continued conflict. It was not a satisfying resolution. It was a real one. Celeste's November concert had produced something she hadn't anticipated. The music critic who'd spoken with her backstage had published a piece in a regional arts publication that was specific and attentive in a way that most music criticism wasn't. It talked about what she was actually doing technically and emotionally, not just that she'd done it well. That piece had been picked up by a national publication's website. The national piece had been seen by a booking agent in New York who had sent her an email the following week that she had read twice and set aside and read again 3 days later. She had signed with the agency in December. She had performed in 3 more cities by February, smaller venues, the right size for where she was, which was not yet a fully reconstituted concert performer, but something real and growing. She had moved out of the hotel and into an apartment in Lincoln Park. Her own lease, her own furniture chosen from a mix of used and new that reflected her own aesthetic rather than the aesthetic of a household staff. She had a Yamaha upright in the living room that she played every morning. She had not filed for divorce. She had not filed for divorce. She was living in the space between those two things, which was not indecision. She had made the decision about who she was and what she needed, but was more like the deliberate pause before a final movement, the held breath that gives what comes next its shape. Dana called every Sunday. They talked for long stretches that moved between the practical and the serious without either of them having to announce the transition. Celeste's niece had started piano lessons, which made Celeste feel something she didn't have a word for. Not exactly pride, not exactly continuity, but a feeling in that general territory. She did not think about Dante every day. She thought about him some days, in the way you think about a significant chapter of your life when something reminds you of it. Not with longing exactly, or not only that, but with the complex acknowledgement that something real had existed and had been damaged by real failures, and that the damage was not entirely one person's fault and was also not one person's fault. She had been thinking about that complexity for 3 months when his text arrived. It was a Tuesday morning in February, and she was at the piano, and her phone buzzed on the windowsill, and she looked at the screen and saw his name. "I'd like to see you. Not to ask for anything, just to talk if you're willing. I'll come to wherever you are, whenever works for you. If it doesn't work for you, I understand that too." She set the phone down. She played through the rest of the passage she'd been working on. A new piece, a revel that she'd been circling for weeks, and was only now beginning to feel she could approach honestly. She played it through to the end of the section. Then she picked up the phone. "Thursday," she wrote. "There's a coffee place on Armitage, noon." She set the phone down and went back to the revel. Whoa. I was there when she arrived. That surprised her slightly. She had half expected him to be late, not from disrespect, but from the operational density of his life, which had been a consistent feature of their marriage. He was sitting at a corner table with a coffee and his jacket on, and the look of a man who had arrived early to a meeting and was not certain how it would go. She sat down across from him. He looked different from the backstage version of him she'd last seen in November, less disheveled, less strung at the edges, but also without the performed composure of the man she'd been married to. He looked like a person who had been through something and had not fully returned to his previous configuration, and she found that she respected it. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You said you wanted to talk," she said. "I want to talk too." The waitress came. Celeste ordered coffee. They waited for it to arrive, and neither of them filled the silence with small talk, which was one of the things she had always appreciated about him. He did not use words to avoid saying things, only to say them or to wait until he was ready. "I owe you the full truth," he said when the coffee came. "About Vivian." She looked at him. She set her hands around the cup. "Tell me." He told her. All of it. Not as a defense, not as mitigation, but as the account itself. The placement, the staged discovery, the robe, the flight schedule that had been leaked to ensure she came home at the right moment to find the right scene. He told her what Vivian had been, what she'd been doing, what had been designed to happen as a result. He told her without managing how he thought she would receive it, which was the harder version of telling it. She listened. Her face did not change dramatically. She had always been a contained person, her reactions happening below the surface before they arrived at the exterior. But he watched her absorb the information piece by piece, watched the slight tightening around her eyes when he got to the flight schedule, watched the moment when the full picture assembled itself in her expression. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "So I was the exit strategy," she said. "Yes." She nodded slowly. She looked at her coffee. Does that change anything? For you? He said. For you, she said. Does knowing it was designed make it easier? Does it let you off the hook for the part that was real? He looked at her. No, he said. The part that was real is still real. She didn't put herself in my house. I put her there, and I... He stopped. Started again. I was not careful with you. I was not careful with what you needed or what you'd given up. The conspiracy explains some of what happened. It doesn't explain what I didn't give you for 9 years. She looked at him for a long moment. She was doing the things she'd always done, reading him past the surface, looking for the angle, the management, the thing behind the thing. What she found was that there wasn't one, or if there was, she couldn't locate it, and she had gotten better at locating those things in the past 3 months. I wasn't honest either, she said. I kept telling myself I'd made peace with things I hadn't made peace with. I kept performing contentment and calling it adjustment. She looked at her hands. I disappeared myself and called it compromise, and I never told you clearly enough what that was costing. You shouldn't have had to, he said. No, she agreed. I shouldn't have had to. But I also made choices. I chose to put the piano in storage. I chose to stop telling you what I needed. I kept deciding that the marriage was more important than being honest inside it, and that's not your failure. That's mine. He was quiet. He was listening in the way she hadn't often seen him listen. Not for information, not for the tactical content, but just listening, taking it in. I'm not saying we're equally responsible for everything, she said. We're not. But I'm done making myself the only innocent party. That's too simple, and I don't think it's true. He nodded. He looked at his coffee. What do you want? He said. Not from me, just what do you want for your life? She almost smiled. I've been playing Ravel, she said. I have a concert in April in Cincinnati and one in June in Boston. I have an apartment with my own furniture and a piano that's slightly out of tune that I'm choosing not to fix because I've decided I don't need everything to be perfect. She paused. I want to keep doing what I'm doing. I want to build what I'm building. I want to play music until it stops feeling like the most honest thing I can do, and so far it hasn't stopped. He looked at her. You're good, he said. The Schubert, I've been thinking about it since November. What you did in that last movement. I let it be light, she said. That's all. I stopped fighting it. He absorbed that in the particular way he had of absorbing things that applied beyond their immediate context. She recognized it. She had spent 9 years watching him do it, and she found, sitting across from him in a coffee shop on Armitage on a February afternoon, that the recognition was not painful. It was just accurate. Are you going to be okay? She asked. It was an honest question, not a rhetorical one. Yes, he said. Not the same, but okay. Different how? He thought about it. He picked up his coffee and looked at it. I used to think running things well was the same as being someone worth running things, he said. I don't think that anymore. They're separate problems. He set the cup down. I got good at the first one and I was lazy about the second. I'm trying to be less lazy about it. She looked at him for a long time. That's more honest than I expected, she said. I've been practicing, he said. She did almost smile then. It arrived at the corner of her mouth and settled there without becoming a full thing. He saw it. He did not press it. They sat in the coffee shop for another 40 minutes and talked about things that were neither the marriage nor the crisis. Her apartment, the Ravel, the city in February, Luca, Dana, the golden retriever in Milwaukee named Archie, who had apparently eaten an entire loaf of bread and survived the experience. They talked the way people talk when they are not performing for each other, and are also not yet certain what they are to each other, which is a specific and uncomfortable and not entirely unpleasant kind of conversation. When they finally moved to leave, they stood on the sidewalk outside for a moment in the cold February air, both of them with their coats on, the city moving around them with its usual indifference. Can I hear you play sometime? He said. Cincinnati or Boston? Whichever. She looked at him. She felt the weight of the question, not the surface of it, but what it was asking underneath. Whether there was a version of the future in which he was present for her life rather than the center of it, a smaller and more honest role, one that required him to show up and watch and not manage the outcome. Come to Boston, she said. June. I'll put your name on the list. Not backstage, he said. Not backstage, she agreed. Just the audience. A seat in the back if you need to leave early. He nodded. I'll be in the front, he said. She looked at him one more moment. Then she turned and walked north on Armitage, and he stood on the sidewalk and watched her go. Not with the possessive attention of a man watching something that belongs to him, but with the simpler and more difficult attention of a man watching something remarkable move away from him at its own pace, under its own power, going exactly where it intends to go. He stood there until she turned the corner. Then he put his hands in his pockets and walked in the other direction. The apartment on Lincoln Park was on the 4th floor, and on clear evenings the window above the piano caught the last of the western light in a way that made the room go warm and amber for about 20 minutes before the light dropped below the roofline. Celeste sat at the piano in that light on a Thursday evening in late February and played the Ravel from the beginning, not for practice, not for performance preparation, just for the playing of it. And what she felt was something she had been trying to find words for since November, and had mostly stopped trying to put into words, because it was the kind of thing that lived more accurately in the music than in language. She had not fixed her life. She had not arrived at a clean conclusion or a resolved state that could be held up as evidence of recovery. She was 41 years old, and she had a slightly out-of-tune Yamaha and an April concert in Cincinnati and a conversation still in progress with a man she had loved imperfectly for 9 years, and who had loved her the same way and with whom the future was genuinely, uncomplicatedly uncertain. She had her grandmother's gold chain. She had her sister's voice every Sunday. She had calluses on her fingertips that were real. She played the Ravel through to the final passage, the one she'd been struggling with for weeks. The place in the piece that required a lightness of touch that she'd kept overcorrecting into something too deliberate, too careful, too controlled. She played it now without correcting it. She played it without managing it. She let her hands do what they knew how to do, and what they did was right. Not perfect, not polished, but right in the way that matters more than either of those things. The last notes settled into the room. The amber light held for another few minutes. Then it went slowly, the way light always goes, and the room returned to its ordinary evening self. And the piano stood in the corner of it, slightly out of tune and exactly sufficient, and the woman sitting at it took her hands from the keys and set them in her lap and breathed. Outside, the city made its continuous sounds. Inside, nothing needed to be said.